Um, I will give you a lesson on two subjects that will accompany you all throughout your personal and professional life from now on, and that has always accompanied you in the past, which are called energy and climate change. So I'm not from the academic world. My job is to be a consultant. I'm a partner in a consulting firm, and I have a second job as president of an association. And I do scientific popularization, which has led to this course and explains why I do this job rather than my job itself. The course I'm going to give you is essentially based on observation data, relatively simple reasonings, and I hope it will be accessible. It's not much different, to be honest, from a few things that I do say in other forums to audiences that have not been meticulously selected by a university entrance exam, so you should normally manage to follow. I will nevertheless remind you two or three little things in the introduction. First, that you will remember what I'm saying much more easily if you take notes while I speak, even if you're going to throw them in the trash after, because taking notes is a great memory aid. The second thing is that I will invite you to always address the problems by reasoning by orders of magnitude and using the cross-multiplication rule. You have entered this school having been carefully selected for your above-average ability to solve complex problems with exact, complete input data. That is to say, we have selected you to enter this school by asking you problems that are unequivocal. They have only one solution. They might be a bit complicated, but they have only one solution and they are well posed. That is to say that in the statement you have all the information to find the solution. Life, and what I'll tell you from now on, is essentially made up of ill-posed problems for which you do not have all the information. And when we tackle a problem that is poorly posed, and that we do not have all the information, there is something that is extremely effective to address these issues, and it is especially true in what I'm going to tell you, which is to reason by orders of magnitudes and cross-multiplication rule. And everywhere in life, if a sophisticated model doesn't match a well-put multiplication rule, cross-multiplication rule, then the model is wrong. These are the few elements that I give you as a preamble to this course that we will have the pleasure of going through together. Here is one of the most famous retirees in France. So, he's retired because apparently he said he was going to stop working. But this isn't quite true because every now and then we see him doing less funny things than that. It doesn't matter, we're going to put him back into service. When you ask a question in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, for those of you who have already watched this excellent game, we give you 4 answers in advance. That is to say, you are told, the student who is sitting there in the second row, does he have a shirt that is A, blue, B, green, C, yellow, B, D, black? Then all those who are sleeping in the bag hide, and the others have the correct answer. Here we will imagine that he asks an open question, that is, he asks you, what is energy? You know that in France there is a Minister of Energy, so you could ask him, what is energy? Normally, he should know since he is Minister of Energy. Well, you would realize if you could ask the question, and I will give you an example in a short time, that in fact, the first answer that comes to the bulk of the population, and I do say most of the population, I'm not talking about the world in which you live in on a daily basis, it's that. My electricity bill. That is, if you say energy in a certain number of places, in particular in places which one qualifies as general public, the first thought that will come to the minds of many people, and this is normal because it is also the first way energy is presented in the world of economics, it is that it is something that can be bought, a convenience. So the main subject is to know whether it's expensive or cheap, and if we could do things differently to have the same thing for cheaper. This is particularly true in the news lately, since for those of you who has followed these types of movements, you know that it has started on a dispute over the price of fuels. Of course, this is not the main reason in fine, but it has started through this dispute, which is a dispute over the price of fuel. Yellow Vests never said, we don't want to consume fuel because it produces too much CO2, or we don't want to consume fuel because it makes us depend on Russia or Norway, we don't want that. No, they just said it's too expensive. What I will try to explain to you during a part of this course is that if you take the problem from this angle, unfortunately, you miss the point. And there are many reasons why we miss the point. The first is that if you look strictly in economic terms at what it costs to buy energy compared to what you earn, and you can represent it in several ways. One of the ways that I can represent it is to look at what it costs every year to the whole economy to buy the oil, gas, and coal that powered it. So I look at the whole economic product of the year, and I look compared to the economical product, what it costs to buy on the market the whole of the oil that we consumed in the year, the whole of the gas that we consumed in the year, and I'm talking of the world as a whole, of course, and the whole of the coal that has been consumed in the year. And the result to which I arrive is that it only costs a few percent of what we earn. Only a few percent. I'll show you a graph in not too long on what it costs for the French to buy energy, and I assure you that paying phone operators, which I will not name, to say, hey, I'm late, or where you at, it costs overall the same price. Same price. It costs a few percent of what you earn. And from the moment when an object placed in an economic debate represents only a few percent of a debate, the normal reflex will be to say, I'm going to take care of it only a few percent of the time. Typically, what you then see in the political debates is, I am interested in energy during the elections for a few percent of the time, then for the rest of the time I give this to someone to whom I delegate the problem and tell him, take care of this shit on your own, just make sure this thing is managed, this is not really my problem, I don't see the link with pensions, with diplomacy, with economic policy, or with a number of printers that there's in the country, I just don't see the connection, so I just consider this a subject detachable from the rest that requires only a few percent of our time. What I'm going to tell you from now on is that this reasoning is as relevant as if I were telling you your brain is 2% of your weight, so I can get rid of it for you. It's no big deal. You'll lose 2% of inefficiency. So reasonings in pie slices, and that's something which is much broader than the issue of energy, reasoning in pie slices will never tell you whether the slices are dependent on one another or not. Another funny reasoning of this type is to say agriculture is 2% of the GDP, so we don't care, let's get rid of it, it doesn't have much importance. Yeah, except if you stop eating, the remaining 98% of GDP pretty quickly are going to become problematic. So with reasonings in pie slices, always be very careful they do not represent the dependence that you may have from one slice to another. And what I'm going to show you from now on is that the dependence of the 97 or 95% of the GDP, which is not energy purchase, are in fact totally dependent in the modern world of the 5% in question. So energy is not a bill, more exactly, it's not just a bill, even if this is how we reason in the economic world in which we live. Another thought often comes to mind when talking about energy. These are the people who tell you, energy, the good energy is the one we save. The second thing I'm going to teach you in this course is that if you are at this moment in this room with the time at choice to sleep, for those of you who take naps, or to listen instead of harvesting potatoes, is precisely because the world has increasingly gorged itself with energy during the 2 centuries which have just passed. The result is that the world we live in today is a world of increasing energy abundance and not at all a world of increasing energy savings. In fact, the good energy, in the sense of that which allowed the emergence of the industrial civilization in which we live, is precisely the one we did not save. Third subject, very fashionable at the moment, is that it isn't important to know what energy is. What's important to know is that it will become 100% renewable. You will see that, in fact, this is not exactly how things have happened. In fact, the right way to approach energy might be that of the poet. Energy is what you're filled in on a morning when you are feeling great, or an afternoon, depending on what time you get up on. Well, this way of seeing things is in fact the right one, because when we consider to be full of energy, this means that we consider having a great ability to master our destiny. I have a lot of energy, I'm in good shape, it means there isn't much that scares me, so I have a great ability to control my destiny. But energy, as we will see from now on, to have a lot of it is precisely having a great capacity to master one's environment. It's that by definition, having a lot of energy is having a great capacity to master the environment. And why is that? Because energy, before being an invoice or a debate subject, is a physical quantity. You know it well, since you had to go through quite a bit of physics to get to this school. Energy is a physical quantity. It's pretty funny, by the way, because in physics there's no totally unequivocal definition of energy. I'll just suggest one to you. For me, energy is what quantifies the change of state of a system, okay? Energy is what quantifies, I do say quantifies, or computes, the change of state of a system. In other words, the more the world around you changes, the more energy came into play. And the more energy comes into play, the more the world around you is transformed. It's that simple. So if I bring it back to transformations of everyday life, or more exactly to objects that transform the environment in everyday life, here are objects that transform the temperature. These objects are used to change temperatures. What I'm showing you here, so either to heat or to cool, these objects use or possibly restore energy. Here are objects that are used to change the speed. A car has only this use. It is used to change the speed of what is contained in the car. You, possibly, and your suitcases if you go on vacation. Well, a change of speed is a change of state of a system. Here are objects which are used to change a shape. You had soil, the soil is excavated, it is placed next to the hole, change of shape. You had a metal sheet, the sheet is stamped, and you have a car door, change of shape. These machines use energy. You have energy that kicks in when you change a chemical composition. By the way, the first chemical composition that constantly changes to provide energy in your environment is called digestion of a food that you eat. In fact, the food serves to provide you with energy. You have energy that comes into play when you have a magnetic field that interacts with an electrical current. It can either, so to say, consume in an engine or supply energy in an alternator. You have energy that comes into play when you rearrange nucleons in a nucleus, and you know that the sun spends its time doing that. It's a big permanent thermonuclear bomb that spends its time assembling hydrogen nuclei to make helium nuclei. You have energy that comes into play when you have matter-radiation interactions. So the matter-radiation interaction that interests you the most is your smartphone. But anyways, it's not just that one. There is the one that will interest us all in a few months, solar radiation at the beach, as shown by this woman there. So in general, using energy is nothing more than transforming the world around us. And conversely, transforming the world around us necessarily assumes that energy has come into play. Once I have told you that, a first small remark, so you know that at the moment we have a Ministry of the Energy Transition. Not just a Ministry of Energy, we have a Ministry of Energy Transition. Well, the Ministry of Energy Transition is probably the oldest ministry in the community of men, since it has been 500,000 years since men are in energy transition. 500,000 years ago, the only energy humans could use was their bodily energy, and then they started to domesticate fire, a first extracorporeal energy. In ancient times, we began to domesticate all renewable energies, and even, by the way, some fossil energies. For example, petroleum was known by the Sumerians, coal was known by the Chinese a few thousand years ago, obviously in small doses. And so the Industrial Revolution was the domestication of fossil fuels. We'll come back to this. So therefore, the energy transition is a permanent state of men. Every time they find a way to use a new energy source, they do it. What characterizes the modern era, and we'll see that it characterizes it in an extremely strong way, and that it is what causes the problem, is that we have radically changed the orders of magnitude in all of these processes in a very, very short space of time. Energy, I told you, is a physical quantity. To say that energy is a physical quantity means that there are many chances that energy is governed by laws that we cannot change. That is the charm of the laws of physics. You can understand what Maxwell's equations are, but once you get the hang of it, you don't get to change them. You can't just say, oh, it will be nice for the purchasing power of consumers if we could change them a little bit. Not worth trying. Regarding energy, you have some laws that apply to us and that we cannot change. Which doesn't mean that we don't try to change them from time to time implicitly by votes in parliament, but all the same, it's better to know them. I told you energy is what quantifies the transformation of the environment. The first cardinal law, which is very easy to keep in mind in terms of energy and that you all know by heart, of course, it is the first principle of thermodynamics, the law of conservation of energy. However, applied to men, the law of conservation of energy has an extremely simple consequence. Men can do nothing better than extract an energy that already exists in the environment and use it for their benefit. This is all that men are able to do. If men were capable of bringing forth energy without interacting with the outside world, we would violate the first principle of thermodynamics. I am sure that in a good Harry Potter you can do that, but in the real world it's more difficult. So any energy we use, we gotta find it in the environment. Any at all. An energy that is in the environment is called a primary energy in the jargon of energy companies. So when you see in the statistics, which I may ask you to look at, the term primary energy, it means that it is the energy as it is found in the environment. There's another term which is very common in energy, and we'll come back to this in a few courses, which is the final energy. The final energy is the one that passes in the end consumer's meter. And who is the end consumer? It's you when you're home and you have a gas meter or an electricity meter, or if you have an oil tank, which is very bad and you shouldn't tell anyone, and a meter on the truck that delivers you the fuel, or when you work in the industry and you have a meter because you're using gas in a glass oven, and so on. As soon as you are an end consumer, individual or industrial, and you buy energy that will allow you to operate a machine, it's called a final energy. And the energy found in the environment, it is called the primary energy. And in between the two, obviously, you have the energy system. Historically, the only primary energies that humans know how to use is food. And also the sun's heat. I should have also put the sun's heat. So historically, the only converter that men have at their disposal is themselves. Because to use energy, you need a converter. You have to put it into something that will transform it. So the only converter that men had is themselves. So they eat, they heat themselves under the sun, and from these energies that they absorb or ingest emerges heat a lot, mechanical work a little. Afterwards, over time, we began to be able to domesticate other converters. Apart from wood, a very rustic converter, we started to domesticate all possible renewable energies. Renewable energies include, at the time, other living organisms because they are completely renewable. Draft animals are perfectly renewable. They eat perfectly renewable grass and therefore provides you with perfectly renewable energy. Wind and water have also been domesticated through mills. Ancient Europe was covered with mills using water than wind. So you have to see that renewable energies are not the future, but the past. Not in the sense that there is nothing to expect from them in the future, but what I mean is that renewable energies were all around our daily lives a few centuries ago. A 100% renewable energy world, I know very well what it looks like. I have at least one sampling point. It's the world 3 centuries ago. This one is 100% renewable. It works very well. So a world with a billion good men on Earth, 30 to 40 years of life expectancy at birth, and 2/3 of the population in the field, I know that it works with 100% renewable energies. There's no problem, since we've done it once. Obviously, the debate today is, do we manage to make our civilization using the engineers from vehicles and the machines that we use today with 100% renewable energy? And we'll come back on this later. And 2 centuries ago, some great engineers and some great physicists said we could use other converters that are themselves non-renewable, in this case, machines made out of metal, and we could give them to eat energy that we do not know yet how to use on a large scale, which is called fossil fuels. There, I summarized to you in one slide what has been the energy history of mankind. First, the converter is us, then there are other living organisms, and slaves were part of them, by the way, then renewable energies, and in fine, metal machines with fossil fuels. What I'm telling you also, which is something very absolutely essential, is that in fact we do not consume energy apart from what we eat. When you see energy consumption somewhere, it is an improper term, because unless I'm mistaken, and I don't think you've ever drank petroleum, if anyone here has, then let me know, but normally no. I don't think you've ever eaten charcoal, maybe just the one that gives flatulence, or that you've breathed gas, not methane in any case, but perhaps the one that gives you Mickey's voice. So we do not consume energy with our own organism. In fact, when we say that we consume energy, it is a misnomer, but it is a misnomer which induces an optical illusion which is extremely strong. Consuming energy is in fact domesticating a machine. So everywhere you see energy consumption, including in my slides, because every now and then I use the shortcut, even though I try to avoid it, you cross out and replace with use of machines. And wherever you see we are consuming more and more energy, you cross out and replace with we're using more and more machines. This is the way it must be understood. In fact, the increasing amount of energy we are using is nothing more than the increase in due proportion of the enormous mechanical exoskeleton that we have created for our benefit. This is energy. And this world of machines is the world you live in. Unless I'm mistaken again, morals and the weather makes you come to this classroom with clothes. If you're dressed, it means that you have put on a piece of garment at some time or another. Putting on an item of clothing takes very exactly, even if you are very clumsy, a few seconds. In the dark, poorly awake, after ingesting substances which I will not name, maybe a few tens of seconds, but never much longer. A few seconds. Well, in a few seconds, you have mobilized to your profit thousands of machines without you realizing it. But you have mobilized thousands of machines to your benefit. You have started by mobilizing to your profit all via agricultural machines, which have, if you have so-called natural textile garment, cotton, linen, etc., you have started by mobilizing to your profit all the agricultural machines which have sown, harvested, and possibly treated the cotton. If you are using a synthetic textile fiber, anything that begins with pulley whatever, nylon, etc., it all comes from petroleum. If you put on an underwear that has synthetic fiber, or a t-shirt that has synthetic fiber, you are putting on a piece of an oil rig, plus the steam cracker, plus the refinery, you know, those little 5 billion euro beasts you observe in the corner of this picture. If you have anything other than an unbleached fabric, it was dyed. It was necessary to manufacture the dyes, so the chemical industry was operated upstream, and then we had to weave the fibers. Let's start with that. Therefore, mechanical machines. It was necessary to dye it, so the chemical industry, and it was necessary to transport it, because obviously it is not where the cotton is grown that it is weaved and dyed, etc. Other machines intervened at all intermediate stages of the supply chains, which are called trucks, trains, and planes. It was necessary to manufacture places in which we install refineries, where we set up chemical factories, etc. These machines have also entered into action. Electric power stations had to supply part of the energy for the process. These machines also came into action. In short, something totally harmless that we do as we breathe, which is called put on a piece of clothing. You don't realize it, but there is an army of machines that worked for you just for this simple gesture. After getting dressed, those who have proper hygiene will wash their teeth, after breakfast of course. Again, it's the same thing. Brushing your teeth is something that takes, let's say, 3 minutes if you follow the doctor's advice, 1 minute if you're in a hurry. You have again used considerable quantities of machines just by doing this simple task. Here you have a photo of a chemical plant in the north of France, which belongs to the Rocket family group, and which has produced a sugar that can be found in toothpaste called sorbitol. So you know that sugar gives cavities, so if you put in toothpaste a sugar that causes cavities, it would be a shame. So the sugar that we put in toothpaste so that it has somewhat of a pleasant taste is a sugar that does not cause cavities. It is a different molecule. In fact, it is one of a few hundred molecules that you will get out of a factory called a starch factory, in which you enter a train full of wagons loaded with corn every day and get out hundreds of different chemicals. And on this site, there are a few thousand people working. This factory runs, 24/7, and it's one of the biggest chemical factories in France. Then your toothbrush tube is plastic, so yeah, tubes aren't really made in metal anymore, so plastic. Again, oil rig, refinery, steam cracker, etc. And your plastic tube does not appear thanks to the Holy Spirit, so you need an extruder that you can see here. You brush your teeth in front of a mirror because otherwise you put stains everywhere. So you had to make the mirror. Here is a train full that makes a mirror. And again, you need the boxes, the trucks, etc. You wash your teeth with purified water. And this is, for example, a machine to purify water. So again, an army of machines has worked for your daily gesture called brushing your teeth. And now I come to the most important item of your life, your phone. It's the same. When you make a phone call, you have mobilized an army of machines for your benefit. It was necessary to manufacture plastics for the phone, to manufacture purified water, etc. Steel must be made for the antenna supports. You have 40 different metals in a smartphone, 40, some present in extremely low concentrations, nevertheless several dozens. Meaning as much mining activities here and there, and mining machines, etc. In a telecom network, which makes it possible to operate the smartphone, because if you're the only one who has a smartphone and the others don't, it doesn't have much use, except if you're playing the little snake game thingy. Otherwise, you need to communicate with others, which requires a network. Here is, for example, a machine that runs cables to make the network, and so on and so forth. So making a phone call is also something that mobilizes thousands of machines for all intermediate stages of construction and operation of a device. So I say it again. Today, we live in a world of machines, and all the machines, without exception, use energy. All of them. And you understand that to reverse the reasoning I showed you earlier, it's 3% of the total, so it doesn't matter. If you deprive instantly the world of energy, it is not 3% of a GDP you're going to lose. It's quite simple to understand. You no longer have functioning transport, you no longer have banks, no more water networks, no more hospitals, no more transport, whatever it is, because no more energy. So you starve, you freeze to death, and you kill each other. Basically, that's what happens if tomorrow morning instantly we deprive the world of energy. So the whole world, the whole modern world depends on it. Whether it costs 1% or 100% of what you earn is not much of a topic. Well, it's a subject, but it's far from being the only subject. From now on, we're going to get into a number of quantitative elements. How is energy counted? You know that when you are given an exercise to enter this school, in general, the unit that you're authorized to use and the only one is the joule. I will use it very little because if I express in joule the sizes that we are going to approach from now on, there would be so many zeros on the slide that you would take too long just looking at it. So often we will use energy units that are a little bit different from the joule, making it possible to avoid the gigas and the megas, and it allows to have smaller things. The first way to remove 6 zeros from the joule is to switch to the kilowatt hour. So the kilowatt hour has an advantage, is that it is what appears on your bills, even if energy isn't just a bill, and it also allows to get closer to things that are more familiar in daily discussions. A French person today uses taking everything into account, including imports. That means including the energy that is used outside France to upgrade the machines that feed the consumption in France. So to take the previous example of your smartphone, it is made in elsewhere in its entirety. Well, that's around 60,000 per year, kilowatt hours. Concerning energy companies, they have a unit that they also like, which saves them another 4 zeros, which is the ton oil equivalent. The ton oil equivalent has a very simple definition. It is the equivalent of the energy released by the combustion of a ton of oil. So a ton of oil does not always have the same combustion energy. It depends on the nature of the oil. We usually add of average quality, and it's worth 11,600 kilowatt hours. From time to time, you will also have units which are brought in from the Anglo-Saxons, notably by the Americans, and you know that the American units are seldom compatible with the metric system. Yes, so the ton oil equivalent fits into this big picture. I will use the electron volt a little bit, but not often. And finally, I will use the slave equivalent, which is roughly 100 kilowatt hours of mechanical energies, and I will explain why right away. Who has already done that here in this classroom? Really? Only this many? Or are the others shy? So who has walked up the Eiffel Tower? Ah, there, much better. We will imagine that for whichever reason that interests you, you decide to climb the Eiffel Tower 6.3 times during the day. Who has ever climbed up the Eiffel Tower 6.3 times? Ah, there we go. There's one. Perfect. Was it to impress the Japanese tourists or for another reason? Okay. So if you climb 6.3 times the Eiffel Tower during the day, the Eiffel Tower being a little bit over 300 meters, you will have climbed up to about 2,000 meters in a day. If I remember, the computation works because it's a little over 300 meters. But, okay. In doing so, you will usually use your legs, since using your arms is harder. The mechanical energy that you will restore with an effort of its nature, which isn't a totally marginal effort for an average person, Using energy equals mass times height times g formula, it's extremely simple. It gives a ridiculous half kilowatt hour over a day. So a man at work who uses his legs to power a mechanical device, whatever it is, like Charlton Heston, who pedals in Soylent Green, well, by the end of a day, he is able to restore or provide of the order of half a kilowatt hour of mechanical energy. If you imagine that this man at work makes this effort every other day, which is another way of saying that he climbs the Eiffel Tower 3 times every morning, by the end of a year, his legs will have provided 100 kilowatt hours of mechanical energy. So over a year of work, the body of a reasonably trained man is capable of providing of the order of 100 kilowatt hours of mechanical energy if he uses his legs. If you use your arms, and by the way a little bit your back as well, and a shovel because it's more difficult with bare hands, and that you clear 6 cubic meters of soil, so that is to say about 15 tons of soil in a day, and in addition to a lot of blisters, you will have provided 0.05 kilowatt hours of mechanical energy, that is to say that you're 10 times more ridiculous than the person who climbed up 3 times the Eiffel Tower with his legs. So a pair of arms at work during the day, that's 0.05 kilowatt hours. And a pair of arms at work over a year, that's around 10 kilowatt hours of mechanical energy. If you burn a liter of gasoline, which costs the outrageously high price of €1.60, which justifies that we find it too expensive, you will get 10 kilowatt hours of thermal energy. And if you want to have a strict comparison, obviously you have to make it go through a machine that will convert the thermal energy into mechanical energy. Even with the best engineers in the world to make cars, which some say come from this school, you will get 2 to 4 kilowatt hours of mechanical energy, no more. Well, it doesn't depend on the engineering, it depends on how the car is operated, the 2 to 4, if it's in close to peak performance or not. Well, so, so if it's close to 2, it's the driver's fault, not yours. So you will obtain 2 to 4 kilowatt hours of mechanical energy. So from 1 single liter of gasoline, of which we will see in a short time that the French still consume not far from 1,000 liters per year, this is the same amount of work, the same ability to change the environment as 10 to 100 days of forced labor of a human being. So I'll say it again differently. When you use a machine that consumes a liter of gasoline, you are able to modify the environment, that is, to provide work at the same level as 10 to 100 humans that are using either their legs or their arms. Don't know if you realize the difference that you have between the energy that is used by machines and by our own bodies. If we convert it all to money, another way of saying the same thing is that to obtain that kilowatt hour of mechanical energy, if I pay a man at work to provide it, it costs a few hundred to a few thousand euros. Well, on the other side, the machine at work provides the same service at a marginal cost, and I'm not counting the price of a machine inside, of a few tens of cents. So when I go from the man at work to the machine at work, without the cost of a machine, I divided the cost of a unit transformation of the environment by a factor of a few hundred to a few thousands. The reason we mechanize everything we can in the economic world is right there. So as soon as you can replace a room boy by a robot, you do it. As soon as you can replace a worker on a supply chain by a robot, you do it. As soon as you can mechanize anything, a farmer for example, and replace it by a tractor, you always do it because of this absolutely considerable difference in price between human labor and energy. This is the reason why we have always sought, since we have efficient machines, to replace man with machines. It even came into play for the replacements of slaves. If you take a slave, which in general is not a vocation of youth, to do so, to make him work, you're going to have to go and get him against his will, so you have to pay money. I remind you that there was a time where the trade of slaves was a business, a completely immoral business under current criteria, but in the meantime it was made for economical reasons. You have to prevent him from killing you, you have to prevent him from escaping, you have to feed him, etc. And when you look at what it costs to get the job of a slave, you realize even that is going to cost you 10 to 100 times more than the machine, which has nothing against its condition as a machine, which doesn't try to get the heck out of here, which doesn't go on strike, which works 24 hours a day. So the reason why slavery disappeared in societies that had access to energy, it's not because our genetic code has so I'm going to take a little detour into a class that some of you didn't go to. It is not because our genetic code has changed. Our genetic code is exactly the same as those of our ancestors 2 or 3 centuries ago. Simply, there is no longer incentive to do things we were doing at the time because we found much better and much less annoying to do the same. So what has freed the slaves is oil, basically. So at this point, I offer you some initial conclusions that I propose or remind you. So I remind you that using energy assumes that energy already exists in the environment. So when in a debate you hear people who say, we should use hydrogen in the environment, there's a place where there's plenty of it, it's called the sun, but it's not very easy to go and get it. For the rest, it's everywhere in linked forms, so in water, there's plenty of it, or in life, etc. But it's everywhere in linked form, so it is not available as an energy source. The molecule is available, but the energy, no. You have to break the bonds, so for example by electrolyzing water, and for that you need more energy than the energy you get from the combustion of hydrogen. So hydrogen is not a primary energy source. When you are told we could use fuel cells are basically engines, they're not energy sources. So what we must compare to the primary energies that we use today are other primary energies, that is, things that we can find in the environment and which can be used as is in the environment. The rest is not available. So since energy quantifies transformation, you have no green energy, and by the way, no pink energy, no more than dark energy. In fact, to choose an energy is to choose a type of transformation, and it is to choose advantages and disadvantages. All energy is dirty if you take it to a sufficient level of use. All of them. The day you cover the entire planet with photovoltaic solar panels, it ceases to be clean. So, clean energy, in general, when you look at the numbers, you realize that it is an energy that is used in sufficiently small quantities so that its disadvantages are also small. In general, that's clean energy. As soon as the energy begins to be used in massive quantities, whatever the mode of extraction from the environment, there are drawbacks. To choose an energy is to arbitrate between the drawbacks we want and those we don't want. This is the subject. Something that is absolutely essential, I will come back to it several times during the first module of the course, is that energy, and I am not talking about what allows us to extract it from the environment, the energy is free. You have all heard, the wind is free, the sun is free, there's no reason not to use it. As a matter of fact, the wind and the sun are free. No one in this room has paid a single penny for the wind to exist or for the sun to exist. But no one else in this room has paid a single penny for oil to exist. Oil is free. What is not free of charge is the consent of a person who was lucky enough to be sitting on it to let go of it. That costs money. And what costs is the work of a few of you who will go to the oil company Total, which is very bad, don't tell anyone, to go poke holes in the earth to get the oil out. That costs money. Oil is free. It's free. So when you pay for energy, all you pay is human labor and interest on human capital to gain access to an energy which is free. We pay only men, and for the rest, money is only used to pay men. You have never seen Mother Nature send an invoice to anyone. So we pay only men. Since energy is physics, and since what you pay is not the energy itself but the work that must be devoted to its extraction from the environment, the price of an energy does not depend on the abundance of an energy itself, because we could tell ourselves if an energy is very abundant, suddenly it becomes even more free than the others. In fact, that is not what matters. If an energy is very abundant, it can still be difficult to extract it from the environment. You know, there's an energy that's totally so abundant in the universe, it's the radiation of empty space, it's 3 degrees Kelvin. I can assure you, you'll never make anything out of it, even if it is absolutely in considerable amounts. So the fact that an energy is in considerable amounts does not say anything about the ease of extracting it and to use it to our benefit. What will matter for the cost of energy, that is the ease of extracting it and using it to our benefit, is the fact whether the pre-existing energy source in the environment is already very concentrated and with few barriers separating us from the axis of this source. The archetype of this stuff is oil. Oil is super concentrated, more than the rest, apart from nuclear, but nuclear is more complicated to use. It's super concentrated, and the barriers that separate us from its axis are not very hard to cross. You know, historically, Mr. Drake went to make freeholes in Titusville and the oil gushed out. So it is not very complicated historically to get oil out. The more an energy is separated from us by great barriers, the more it is diffuse, the more it will be expensive to extract it from the environment. It's just physics. I'll show you a quick little comparison. Let's imagine that I take the air volume in this room, which is not very far in orders of magnitudes, to a cube of sides 10 meters. Imagine that I make it blow at 80 kilometers per hour, which represents at choice for the meridionals a good mistral and for the sailors 45 knots of wind, and I pass that through a wind turbine. If I pass this wind through a wind turbine, it will put my wind turbine into motion and provide me with electricity. This electricity is an energy, so I can count it. The amount of electricity that I get from 1,000 cubic meters of air at 80 kilometers per hour that passes through a wind turbine is the same as the amount of energy that I get from burning 3 milliliters of petrol. 3, not 3 tons, not 3 liters, not 30 liters. 3 milliliters, 3 tiny milliliters. Regarding the amount of human labor to be invested, in your opinion, is it easier to go and make a hole in Saudi desert and bring out 3 milliliters of oil, or is it easier to build a wind turbine, waiting for the wind to blow and recover the electricity that comes out of it? Well, the answer is in the price, since money only pays people. If you use a wind turbine, you will, in Europe, pay your kilowatt hour of electricity from 6 to 8 cents at the output of a wind turbine, and at that price I only give class when the wind blows. When there's no wind, the video projector does not work, if there's no microphone, it doesn't matter, I can do it with my hands or speak a little louder, but on the other hand, those of you who came with the metro, there is no metro either, which may be more of a problem. There's no party either tonight if the wind does not blow. It starts to become really, really annoying at this point. And there's no alarm clock tomorrow morning if it uses electricity. You know, the fridge cannot cool the beers, etc. It's a real disaster. So if there's no wind, the system stops. If you want the system not to stop when there's no wind, you need to add the cost of storage. And so at this point, you basically multiply by 3, sometimes by 6. So the order of magnitude of the stored kilowatt hour with wind, it is a few tenths of cents. Compared to that, the order of magnitude of the cost of the kilowatt hour already stored, since when you take the oil out of the ground is already a stock, which you can use today, tomorrow, the next day, the day after tomorrow, the next week at 3 a.m. exactly when you wish. Well, this kilowatt hour of oil already stored right out of the Saudi desert is worth 0.3 cents. Therefore, between the cost of a kilowatt hour extracted from wind, a diffuse source, it is not dense, the air 1.2 kilograms per cubic meter, it is really not dense, and the cost of a kilowatt hour right out of a Saudi oil well, you have a factor of the order of 100 on the cost of providing the stored kilowatt hour. And even there, the wind turbine, you made it with oil. The system is not closed, but it's to say that to manufacture the wind turbine, you have benefited from an efficient industrial system, which provided you the extraction of copper from the mine, bauxite mining, iron ore extraction from the mine, the upstream metallurgy, the assembly of all this mess, the transport, the concrete blocks erected, etc. All of this was done with fossil fuels. If you had to do all of this with other wind turbines, it isn't completely certain that the price of wind power would still be 6 to 8 cents per kilowatt hour. We can take the bets. My bet is that it will be a tiny bit more expensive. So even making wind turbine using fossil fuels, you realize that you have a factor of a few tens to 100 between a kilowatt hour from the wind and a kilowatt hour from an easy oil well. And it is irremediable because it's physics. So, it is for this reason that historically we have not gone from fossil fuels to renewables, but we have done the exact opposite. So, 2 centuries ago, the Navy was 100% renewable. And besides, since the wind was not always blowing, you need to take lemons on board to make sure the sailors didn't get scurvy. We said, to bring the Zara t-shirt quickly, because the t-shirt is not made in France, it's much better to have a 100% fossil-based navy. It's much more efficient and it goes much faster. A few centuries ago, we had a 100% renewable transport system, and we told ourselves, to feed École des Mines for lunch, it's not great. It's much better to have 100% fossil-based transport. It works better. We had 100% renewable agriculture, but we told ourselves, to have a very productive agriculture and to allow the farmers' kids to go study, it's not great. It's much better to have 100% fossil-based agriculture. We had 100% renewable public works. That's what the Romans built the Roman roads with. It wasn't very quick. To make 1,000,000 kilometers of roads in France, it's much quicker to use a machine like this. It goes much faster. And we had 100% renewable construction industry, essentially to make Notre Dame. Nowadays, it's going to be a little faster to redo the roof, but I mean, yep. And probably a few centuries to make the pyramids. It was not very efficient. To do the D2 tower at La Défense, it's much better to use fossil fuels. It goes much faster. We had 100% renewable industry. Again, it was not very efficient to do all the items you have on you at low costs. It did not work so well, so it was much better to have 100% fossil industry. And we had 100% renewable dryers, that is to say, the sun. It was not very efficient, so much better to burn gas to do that, so it goes faster. So it's been 2 centuries, precisely because the physical characteristics of fossil fuels are superior to the physical characteristics of renewables, which man, who is an accumulative animal, has spent his time switching from renewable energies to fossil fuels to be able to accumulate faster. That's exactly why we came down this road. So, when you see that, you realize that to go the other way, simply because the political promise is that we're going to get there without changing the living standards of people, just by seeing that, you tell yourself, are we totally sure about that? Do I sign with all my savings plus those from my parents plus those from my grandparents on the fact that it's going to work? Incidentally, when you are in doubt about something, it is a very good question to ask yourself. That is to say, would I agree to bet all of my parents' savings on what I'm declaring? End of parenthesis. If you have the slightest doubt on the fact that the answer is not yes, it's that basically you're not totally convinced by the arguments or by what you're being told. So renewables, we know them very well. It's the world from which humanity emerges. And I insist, I'm not saying that we shouldn't go back there. I'm just preparing you to the conclusion that we will certainly not go back there with a constant consumption. Certainly not. Not with 7 billion good men on Earth. So here you have our converters of old times. It was completely immoral and completely inefficient. You see, totally inefficient. On the other hand, it was completely renewable. And we have now switched to modern day converters, which are much more efficient, no doubt on that. Now, if I'm not talking about energy, but I'm talking about power, you see that a man at work, as I told you earlier, in a day of labor, we can do between 0 and 0.5 kilowatt hours. If you divide by the 5 hours of work, actually it should be 10, but whatever, you see that it means that on average, the average power during this span is somewhere between 10 and 100 watts. I take a tractor. An ordinary tractor today has a power of a few tens of kilowatts. A tractor has the same power, by the way, than a construction machine, which has 100 kilowatts. If one day you're a little curious, next time you pass by a construction site, all the construction machinery have a little small plate which has the engine's power. It's hidden somewhere, like under the swivel part or wherever. It's not very complicated to locate. Go look for curiosity's sake. You will see that the machine's power is between a few tens of kilowatts to 100 kilowatts for a big excavator. If you substitute legs, a few hundred. If you substitute arms, a few thousand. So the two machines you have here are capable for the tractor to replace a few hundred pairs of legs or a few tens of draft animals, and the public works machine or the construction machine a few thousand pairs of arms. It is thanks to this that we were able to increase the productivity of a farmer by a few hundred. because he didn't grow hundreds of arms or hundreds of legs like Shiva, the farmer, we just gave him an exoskeleton. And it's thanks to this that today we can build a house, that and a whole bunch of other machines like cement plants, trucks, etc. We can build today a house for the cost of a few years of salary, something was totally unthinkable for inhabitants of ancient times. Until 2 or 3 centuries ago, it was just unthinkable that anyone could build his house for a few years' worth of salary. It didn't exist. A truck pedals like a few thousand times the driver's legs. A plane, thanks to the young and handsome, well-paid pilot, pedals like 1,000,000 times the legs of a pilot. The Aeroflot one must have not pedaled hard enough. An industrial rolling mill hammers or crushes steel like the whole Parisian region population to whom I have given a hammer. So you see, just to replace the rolling mill of Fos-sur-Mer, if we had no energy, you wouldn't be listening to this course right now, although some of you might be better off with it. You would be banging on metal sheets with a hammer, only to replace the rolling mill of La Fos-sur-Mer. The whole Parisian region with a hammer, hammering all day. Here you have another auxiliary of agriculture, which has helped save a few million pairs of arms. It's called a steam cracker. And it's something used to prepare organic chemistry. So, at this point, we agree on the fact that energy quantifies transformation, on the fact that in order to use energy, we need a converter, on the fact that most of the converters we use today are no longer our own bodies but are machines. Now I will quantify the machine park and how it is composed by person. I told you historically we have used mainly renewable energies. Here you have a graph that starts in 1860 and that quantifies only one of the renewable energies that we have used in ancient times, because for wind and water it was difficult to find long time series of statistics. I'm sure someone will manage to piece it together, but I didn't manage. So here we start with wood. Wood, a century and a half ago, humanity uses some. Humanity uses it to fuel stoves to heat themselves, or to supply forges. And by the way, the beginning of metallurgy has been a massive factor of deforestation, or a very important factor of deforestation in Europe, and to operate the first steam engines, which start to emerge here and there. So at that time, an inhabitant of the world, an Earthman, consumes on average 5,000 kilowatt hours of wood per year. So you see that per person, since that time, the amount of wood used has decreased. Not in total, but per person, it has decreased. It is the only energy that has followed this evolution. Afterwards, man started to use coal. So some of the coal has replaced wood. For example, in Europe, we began to use coal. Well, before we were using charcoal or wood coal, and then we started to use the so-called earth coal, the two are called coal, to operate forges, and then to operate steam engines. And you see that the amount of coal used per person in the world, which was extremely small a century and a half ago, now amounts to roughly 5,000 kilowatt hour per person per year. What you see on this graph as well is that the amount of coal used per person in the world has never gone down since we began to use coal. Never at any time has coal been an energy of the past for men. Never at any time. In fact, you today unknowingly use a lot of coal through everything imported from countries where it is made in coal, starting with China. So as soon as you see somewhere made in China, it's made in coal and directly feeds your consumption, indirectly, obviously, of coal. 2/3 of the coal that we use today on Earth is actually used in an intermediate machine in the energy system called the electric power plant. 2/3 of the coal mined on Earth powers an electric power plant. In the rest, you have a 10% approximately, which feeds metallurgy. These are special coals very rich in carbon called cokes. The rest is used to operate heating networks, stoves, district heating, domestic heating, etc. But 2/3 are the electric power plants. You know that in France we have a big debate about our nuclear power plants. Remember that today in the world you have between 30 and 40 times, between 30 and 40 times the nuclear power installed in France deployed as coal-electric power plants. So in France, we have 60 gigawatts of nuclear power, so that's 2,000 gigawatts of coal-electric power plants installed around the world. We will come back to this during the climate course, but in the Paris Agreements, by the way, does that ring a bell to anyone? Well, the objective of the 2 degrees contained in the Paris Agreements assumes, for example, that all these coal power plants are gone by the time you're my age. So until you're my age, which is not that far off, I can assure you, well, all of the coal electric power plants worldwide must disappear. So you see there's a bit of road left. Afterwards, men used oil. So what you can see on this graph in an absolutely spectacular way is that oil has never replaced coal. Oil has never replaced coal. You see that the use of oil per person came in addition to the use of coal per person. The reason for this is that oil does not at all have the same uses as coal. Oil is the main energy for mobility because oil is the energy that has the best ratio of energy transported per unit volume. Okay? In a liter, so a cubic decimeter, if you put something that you use for your energy supply, there's nothing better than oil. It's liquid at room temperature, so it's something that is stored and transported extremely easily. And since it is the most dense per unit volume, in modes of transport where you have to take your energy with you so that you can be sure to go wherever you want to, oil won hands down for almost all modes of transport. Today, 98% of what rolls, flies, or sails uses oil. While I remind you that the first car to have exceeded 100 kilometers per hour in the world was electric, I also remind you that the efficiency of the electric motor is 3 to 4 times the efficiency of the oil engine. So it is not because the oil engine is intrinsically superior that it has supplanted the electric motor in the competition that took place a century ago. It is because with electricity you have a lot more trouble taking with you the energy that allows you to be independent. That's the reason. You also see something that happened before you were born, right here. The sudden stop, and I do say sudden, of the quantity of oil available per person on Earth. This episode has a rather peculiar name in the history of energy. It's called the oil shocks. I will come back to it at length. The oil shocks, everyone kept it in mind as a time where the price got very high and then it got very low again, and next topic, let's forget about it. In fact, no one has forgotten. This was the moment when the oil supply was growing strongly and where it stopped growing strongly, while the per capita oil supply was growing strongly. And not only has it stopped growing strongly, but it has also started to decrease and then stabilize. So the oil shocks are not just a price episode. In fact, that's just the foam at the surface of a wave. The major characteristic of the oil shocks is that it's the stop of a rapidly expanding world. That's the oil shock. And we'll come in a short time on what it means in economical terms. Then came the gas. So gas, bis repetita, has now replaced oil. It has added itself on top of that. Then comes hydroelectricity. Similarly, hydropower has been added on top of that. Then comes nuclear power, which has been added on top of that. And then come the new renewable energies, which you see there, and that's this stuff everyone is talking about. We only talk about this, the new renewable energies. You have here described per individual what these new energies represent in the world, and as I am, despite appearances, a nice guy, I took the friendliest conversion convention possible to count them, because since most of these energies are purely electrical energies, so solar and wind, you have two ways of accounting for them in an energy balance, since historically, most of the electricity has been produced with thermal modes. I mean, electric power plants are Carnot heat engines for the most part. You burn coal or gas or oil or fission uranium, and it creates heat, and with this heat you operate a turbine, which is a Carnot heat engine. And in a Carnot engine, you have a maximum yield, 1 minus T2 over T1, and often electricity is counted in primary equivalent, that is to say we count the thermal energy that would have been required in order to make the same amount of electricity for modes that are purely electrical. hydroelectricity mostly, then solar and wind. This is the convention that I have used for this chart. However, today it is something that has much more place in the pagination of a newspaper than in the effective energy consumption in the world. And you will see in not too long that not only is it true in absolute value, but unfortunately it is also true in dynamics. On the other hand, another thing which is capital when you look at this graph, which is that today the amount of energy mobilized per person per year, extracorporeal energy I should clarify, is of the order of 20,000 kilowatt hours. So an Earthling mobilizes on average through the enormous exoskeleton that constitutes the park of machines, 20,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. With the small equivalence I gave you earlier, so that's in primary energy, so thermal energy, therefore in mechanical energy would be less, obviously, but you will be replacing legs and arms. And what I tell you is that, roughly speaking, each Earthling has at his disposal 200 people, or 200 slaves, who work for him at all time. I'll tell you in another way, the fleet of machines that we have built who work for us has the same mechanical strength as if our muscular power was multiplied by 200. So you are, we have become Superman, but for real. It is not a figment of the imagination. Except that instead of, like Popeye, stuffing ourselves with a can of spinach and become super powerful, we stuff ourselves with a barrel of oil and become super powerful. Well, not us, but our exoskeleton, that is to say, the machines. I'll tell you again in another way, the material production of humanity today at 7 billion people is equivalent in volume, thanks to machines, to what we would have if we were 1,400 billion people and no machines. Is that clear? Obviously, we don't have the means to feed 1,400 billion people on Earth. So in fact, thanks to energy and thanks to machines, we have been able to develop a productive capacity that is beyond measure compared to the muscular power of our organism, and we spend our days using prosthetics. The Error metro line that brings me here is a prosthetic. It's an extension of my legs. The car that you might use in the plane even more are prosthetics. They are extensions of our legs. We spend our time using prosthetics. Most of this energy is fossil. So why fossil? Quite simply because it is remains of ancient life. A fossil is very simple. Again, it has a definition. It is a remain of ancient life. We'll see this in the next course, but coal is a rest of plant life, ferns, that grew in the coal era, the Carboniferous, and oil and gas are remains of plankton and microalgae that have lived anywhere between a few million years ago and a few 100 million years ago. So it's fossil energy, and by far, that dominates today's world supply. And this energy allowed to set in motion a park or a growing exoskeleton, which has made each and every single one of you Iron Man for real. We have all become Iron Man for real. We don't have a little shining light in the center and stuff in front of the eyes, but it's exactly that. So here are little pieces of your Iron Man costume and mine. Washing machines, elevators, vacuum cleaners, tractors, backhoe loaders, Ariane rockets, satellites, water purifiers, rolling mills, wire drawing machines, etc. All of these are pieces of your Iron Man costume. And without this Iron Man costume, you would have the life of a French peasant, the same he had a few centuries ago, with 30 years of life expectancy at birth, no salary increase between birth and death. The idea of a salary increase with age, it's a modern idea. It didn't exist in the old days, and so on and so on. So what has literally changed the life of mankind is energy and the fleet of machines that allows us to use it. That's why the fact that it's only worth 3% of what we spend is an optical illusion. It is at the center of 100% of what happens to you. It's 100%. In fact, with the little economic convention that I showed you earlier, saying that the energy today and the fleet of machines using it is 200 times the muscular power of mankind, if the contability was in phase with this physical reality, in the accounts of companies, energy should be worth 200 times more than salaries. This is what should happen. So your starting salary should be roughly divided by a factor 1,000, basically. This is roughly what we should do. if we wanted to have the same accounting relation with costs as the physical relation on the contribution of the transformation of the world. I'll tell you again differently because I'll come back to this in a short time. People today for production are only necessary to control machines. For the rest, are basically useless. For essentially all jobs we do today in the world, I cut off both your arms, both your legs, and allow you to control a computer with your brain, and it still works. Really, it still works. And so this exoskeleton, with its characteristic energy, it allows to have the same productive capacity. So for the world average, it's a factor of 200, but in France, the average is more like 600. So the French yellow vest, who doesn't even realize it, and this is the unspeakable political reality, lives like a mogul. He lives like a mogul. What bothers him is that the French billionaire Bernard Arnault lives even more like a mogul than him, and he has probably very correct to think so, but in the meantime, he lives like a mogul himself, right? Because of this exoskeleton. These modern-day slaves have another absolutely considerable advantage compared to renewable energies of ancient times, is that they free the entire surface for us. Because the energy slaves of ancient times, either renewable energies or other living organisms that which we needed, were mobilizing ground surface. A draft animal mobilizes ground, so the soil that is needed to feed the draft animal is no longer available to feed humans, or a transport animal for that matter. So at the time, we, especially in agriculture, needed to mobilize a large part of the surfaces to feed the draft animals and be able to cultivate the rest of the surfaces for men. Modern-day slaves eat from the basement, so they leave the entire space available to us. This is one of the reasons for which, when we talk about going back to renewable energies, we see land use conflicts appear. For example, to grow crops for energy purposes, it comes back directly to the conflict with food crops, which means that we are forced, for a part of the energy that we use, to return to the ground compared to the advantage that we had of being able to take from the basement. So we come back to a two-dimensional system, whereas we had succeeded into going into a three-dimensional one, in a way. Some orders of magnitude of common energy use. So this thing is very old, so but the orders of magnitude still hold. There may be a factor 2 in decrease for some of them, but that's okay, it sets the big picture. Anything you see, of course, I can translate to slave day units, which I did. Remember, mainly looking at this graph, that most of the energy consumption of a Westerner, therefore of the machines that he mobilizes for his own benefit, it isn't the light bulb nor the recyclable coffee mugs. So, in this context where I speak to engineers who are supposed to manipulate orders of magnitudes, it is not with small gestures that we avoid big problems. We can have small gestures to tackle the big problems, but it does not replace the need to take care of a big problem. I'm telling you because in the world I live in, which is the corporate world, it is still very, very common that we confuse the orders of magnitudes deliberately. We hide behind our pinky saying, look, it's fabulous, I put a beehive on the roof, I put recyclable cups at the canteen, you know, like one day per year people come by bike and, you know, like... No, it doesn't work like that, obviously. Here you have a few orders of magnitudes on the energy consumption. You see that what will weigh very, very heavy in what we buy and the way we move. And when we'll talk about climate change, we'll see that the way we eat is something significant and the way we're housed. So basically, the size of the accommodation we occupy and the energy we use to occupy it and the amount of stuff we buy in the year, as well as the way we move and the number of kilometers we cover in the year, are much more impactful than turning off the light when we exit a room. These are totally different orders of magnitude. At the same time as per person, because until now I spoke about quantities per person, where orders of magnitudes have fundamentally changed, the size of a population has also fundamentally changed. Here you have an approximate reconstruction, approximate because of course our National Statistics Agency, INSEE, was less performant 10,000 years ago. So you have an approximate reconstruction of human population. So why 10,000 years ago? Why does this graph start 10,000 years ago? Can anyone yes? You? No, not that. Yes, it's when man became sedentary. That is to say that 10,000 years ago, and we will see this during the course of climate change, we finished the end of the last ice age. Then we come to the beginning of the warm interglacial phase, which is the one we knew until we started to put in motion man-made climate change, which is to say a period of stability, very strong stability to say, of the climate, which allows man to become sedentary. That is to say that with a stable climate, the resource that allows you to feed yourself doesn't wander about everywhere because it moves according to climate, okay? So it always stays in one place and you can start to become sedentary. At that time, men were a few million on Earth, and I say it again, INSEE was not extremely efficient at that time. At the start of the Industrial Revolution, so I recall the life expectancy at birth of inhabitants of planet Earth in 1800, it was just under 30 years old, and by the way, it was inferior in the cities than in the countryside because at that time the city was a place of concentration of miasmas of all kinds, so as soon as you had a disease, it was much easier to catch and die from it than in the countryside, right? You also had the same thing for infant mortality. So in 1800, we are a billion. And what you see is that for 2 centuries, there has been an evolution which looks more like a hyperbola than an exponential, and at the same time, that the quantity of resources of all kinds consumed per individual has increased. So some of the people I know, myself included, ask themselves the question whether this demographic evolution could have taken place without the abundant energy. Because if we didn't have abundant energy, it is not completely sure that the cereal yields would have gone from 10 to 80 quintals per hectare in the Parisian region. It is not completely sure that we could have transported the food from where it grows to everywhere it is needed. It is not completely sure that we would have known how to preserve it against heat, cold, or the little animals that want to eat it for us. It is not completely sure that we could have brought drinkable water and evacuated the miasmas of the cities, etc. So there's a whole bunch of things that are not completely sure in a world where we don't have fossil fuels, and therefore it is not completely sure that we would have had 7 to 8 billion people. And if the question arises as to whether 7 or 8 billion people is not the consequence of abundant energy, at this moment, obviously, the corollary question which arises is, from the moment when we enter a strong energy recession, do we remain 8 billion individuals? And that's not completely sure either. If I do population times individual use, this is what I end up with on the total amount of energy used by humans, which is to say, roughly speaking, the evolution of a fleet of machines. Knowing that between here and there, much less energy is required to run a machine because your predecessors and mine were clever on how to operate machines, and therefore have one inefficiency. So what you see there is a lower bound of the fleet of machines in operation in the world. So it's probably close to the fleet of machine here, and there it's probably closer to a tenth of the fleet of machine in operation in the world. What you see is that between my parents' generation and my children's generation, the amount of energy used by man has been multiplied by a small factor of 10, and in my opinion, with the energy efficiency that there has been in that same period of time, the fleet of machines in operation in the world has been multiplied by a factor of a few tens. It is not completely certain that between you and your grandchildren's generation the same thing happens. It is actually quite certain that this will not happen. So it's quite certain that the world you're going to know, and me for a few decades I still have left to live if all goes well, will not be a world extending the trend of what we had in the past. I remind you that physical systems are rarely linear systems. In general, they are nonlinear systems, and in nonlinear systems you cannot reason by induction. It's better to avoid it. If I look at the mark of man on his environment, I can approximate the mark of man on his environment by the quantity of energy that he brings into play, since, I repeat, the quantity of energy that we bring into play is the flow of transformation that we operate by definition of what energy is. For that, I take the energy per person times the population, and it gives me something that resembles the evolution of man's mark on the environment. Well, here's the population. I multiply by the energy used per person, and here is, in first order approximation, how the mark of man on his environment has evolved on a planet that was 13,000 kilometers in diameter at that time, and that still is 13,000 kilometers in diameter now. So you understand that the environmental problems that we have today are not necessarily problems that qualify in different ways than what we had in the past. On the other hand, they quantify in different ways compared to what we had in the past. We have today a tiny weeny problem of orders of magnitude. And when you see that, you also understand that we have put the system a little bit out of balance, and that it is not completely certain that it will remain in that state for an extremely long time. There I am preparing you for something that I will detail further in other courses, which is the fact things are going to happen anyway in the future, and in any case, in the future, the world will not remain stable. In any case. And so I have, basically a choice between I wait for the instability to arrive as it wants to arrive and I endure it, or I trigger the instability within the limits of what I can still more or less control. But it will be one or the other. Two little compliments on the evolution of the amount of energy used in the world. You have here the variation of the amount of energy used by humans between 2000 and 2017. What you see is that, notwithstanding the media narrative about the fact that it's really good because we have more and more wind and solar production, which you have here, the three energies that have increased the most during this period and by far are the three fossil energies, and in particular coal. So the fossil fuel that has increased the most since we started having big debates about climate is coal. Over this period, coal has grown more than 10 times more than solar, counted in primary equivalent, and more than 5 times more than the wind power. So if the newspaper had pagination reflecting the facts, for one article yapping about solar, you should have 15 talking about coal. This is what should happen. And if you look today at what you have as a supply, so I'm making the pie chart of the historical evolution I showed you earlier, you see that it's fossil fuels that dominate the world's supply from head to toes. In first position, oil, then coal and gas. If I just look at the renewables, you see that what arrives first is wood, followed by hydroelectricity. I would point out to you that the first two terms of a renewable supply of France are the same to wood and hydroelectricity. It's not because the newspapers again tells you all about wind and solar that it's all that matters. In the French renewable supply, it's clearly wood and hydroelectricity by far. The following terms are much, much lower. And so here is the French renewable supply. Small graphic that I made no later than yesterday with statistics that were published no later than last week or 2 weeks ago. What you see is that the first two terms by far of a renewable energy supply in France are wood, which is mainly used for heating, and hydroelectricity, which is used to generate electricity. Here you have wind and solar, and you see that solar is in fact one of the weakest terms in the French renewable supply. Behind many things, heat pumps, waste incineration, etc. All of these renewables, so here we have millions of tons oil equivalent, I told you I would come to tons equivalent, in a French consumption which amounts approximately to 250 of this same unit. So you see what the renewable energies represent in this big picture. Okay, so I give you all a 5-minute break. Make sure to talk a lot during that time, not in my class, and only 5 minutes, not 15. Thank you a lot. I will now come back to the prices. You have probably, for some of you, heard, and I will come back to this in the next class, but I will do a little preview today, that the price of energy, which I hope is not being discussed at the back of the class, so must increase sharply if energy becomes more scarce, which has the corollary that more abundant energy should see its price sharply lowered. In fact, the price of all energies is more or less subservient to the price of oil. Here you have the price of oil expressed in constant currency, that is to say currency corrected for inflation, for a century and a half. You see something quite interesting. The price of oil, in fact, on long trends, there's 1 century during which it is rigorously stable expressed in constant currency, regardless of the quantity produced. And you see that at the time of the oil shock, which characterizes a strong variation in the derivative, that is, the production rises quickly and stops rising quickly, the price increases sharply and then comes back more or less to its previous level. Then comes a new shock where the price increases sharply and then comes back to something not very, very far from its previous level. So the idea that the price of oil is something that follows the abundance of the offer is not confirmed by the graph you see there. On the other hand, the real price of things, in fact, is not the price expressed in money, it is the price related to the only quantity which remains incompressible over time, that is, the 24 hours of a day. In other words, the real price of anything is not the price expressed in money, it is the price expressed in the minutes of working time. If you want to express a price in minutes of working time, you must relate a price to how much people earn. So you must relate the price of oil, in this case, to what people earn, which is what you see here, that is, the GDP per person. At this moment, we fall back on our feet. You see that over the last century or century and a half that has just passed, the price of a barrel of oil was divided by, say, 15 to 20, which means that with the efficiency of machines which has increased at the same time, the price of a kilowatt hour of mechanical energy has been divided by 50 to 100. We find the same dividing factor as the one we have when we compare the price of an old renewable energy with the price of a modern fossil energy. We will always fall back on this same dividing factor or multiplying factor of a few tens to 100, which also represents the evolution of a human producing with his arms and legs to the 200 slave equivalents per person we have today. Basically, whatever the direction from which you tackle the problem, the passage of a renewable civilization to the fossil civilization has been the appearance of Superman and Iron Man for each of us, with a multiplication by an order of magnitude between 800 to several hundreds of the capacity to act on the environment. And of course, suddenly, all the undesirable byproducts of this capacity to act have also been multiplied by several hundreds. We have stolen a lot of surface from other living beings, that's why there's a loss of biodiversity. We have induced a lot of pollution in the environment of all kinds, so there's a whole bunch of substances that we've added to the environment while we were increasing the transformation flows. It is a perfectly logical consequence of that. If we look at a more recent period, on the other hand, you see here the price of energy compared to what the French earn. You can see that the yellow vests may be right and are surely right for their particular case, but they are wrong for the population as a whole, since the price of energy compared to what people earn in first approximation has never been as low as it is today. So when we say, the liter of oil at €1.50, okay. Except that we forget that people's pay slips has increased in proportion and even a little faster. I already said it implicitly, and I'll say it again more explicitly. This abundant energy allows you to be seated here today in this class, and in general, it radically changed the world that surrounds us with regards to work, to jobs. Almost all of the people you know today work in services, work in the cities, work in the tertiary sector. And I do say almost all of the people you know. It is a very recent situation, which is the consequence of the increase in energy supply. You have here the evolution of the salaried workforce in France, broken down into farmers in green, manual workers in black, and service workers in blue. These three curves cover 2 centuries, and I open a little parenthesis. The more you have long sets when you look into a process, the better off you are. The best way to misinterpret a process is to have a data series which is too short compared to the characteristic timescales of the variations of what you're watching. So you need to have a somewhat long series if you want to understand something. What you see is that 2 centuries ago, 2/3 of the working population worked in agriculture. They were before farmers. You can also deduce something, which is that if 2/3 of the working populations are in the field, it is because the productivity of a farmer at that time is sufficient to feed himself plus half a person who's doing something else. That's what it means. So a farmer can feed 1.5 people. And then you see that the workforce in agriculture then increases softly like the volume of agricultural production until 1850. So what's happening at that time? You do not have, at this time, any significant increase in agricultural productivity. Basically, a farmer from 1850 is as productive as a farmer from 1800, a little bit more, but not much. On the other hand, what is happening is that the population is increasing, and therefore forests are cut to increase the cultivated area. We are deforesting in Europe exactly like we are deforesting nowadays in Latin America or in Southeast Asia, and exactly like we did back then in the US and in Russia. At all times, population growth has required from sedentary populations that we cut forests to replace by cultivated areas. This is what the Europeans are doing, and so including the French. And so we cut the forests until there's not much left to cut, meaning that in 1850 we went through the minimum of surface area. 15% of France was covered in forests, no more. Today is 25%. And the 15% covered in forests are mainly areas that are complicated to cultivate, mountains notably. Then the industry begins to develop aids for agriculture that make the farmer more productive. We start to develop draft collars, plows, etc. It's the beginning of forages in the industry, which allows to multiply the auxiliaries for the farmers. The first combined harvester, from memory, is the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, and it is horse-drawn back then, obviously. And so we bring to the farmer auxiliaries that make it possible to reduce the number of farmers, to replace them by machines or draft animals in the fields. At this point, obviously, it frees up arms so that some people can go and do something else, and which feeds, but not only, the growth in workforce in other sectors. And then after the war, so there Iron Man comes for real. So you know Iron Man is an American creation in the Marvel comics. So it's really the Americans, since in this case Americans bring the tractors and fertilizers that they start to develop at home. And we replace the human workforce and draft animals by much more efficient, that is, tractors and fertilizers. In return of what, as I said earlier, but I'll repeat, the cereal yield in Beauce, for example, has been multiplied by 6 to 8 between 1945 and 1975. You know, 6 to 8, I don't know if you realize. And at this time, we can free up a lot of pairs of arms and legs who work in agriculture to send them elsewhere. So where is elsewhere? Well, we send them in the industry or in the craft industry, which is the same thing. In industry and crafts, we are able, thanks to the increasing energy supply, to set in motion an increasing number of machines. And every time I have a machine that starts up, I need someone to pilot it. I have a production line of cars, I need workers who work on the line. I have a jackhammer, I need a worker to operate the jackhammer. I have a crane, I need someone who operates the cranes. So we're building more and more machines. And it turns out that the energy supply at that time, we are during the glorious 30s, so you have seen the rate at which the oil per person increases. The energy supply at that time increases faster per person than the unit size of the machine. It's a horse race. And so despite the fact that I have bigger and bigger machines, I can create more and more jobs because the flow, the fleet of machines basically increases. So the number of machine increases because the unit size of the machine is growing less rapidly than the energy supply per person. So I can increase the number of machines and so increase the number of jobs in the industry. After the oil shocks, the reverse is true. The unit size of the machine continues to increase as the per capita energy supply stops increasing. At this time, I need less and less people to control machines, which are, by the way, increasingly bigger and which will continue to increase the industrial production. Industrial production in France has doubled between 1974 and 2007. So after the oil shocks, we did not deindustrialize, we did another industry, fewer stocks and more planes. On the other hand, what happened is that the unit size of the machine has continued to increase, even as the energy supply per person, it has stopped increasing. So we have reduced the workforce in the industry to operate machines that are individually larger, but which as a whole produced more. But here, what I'm looking at is the number of people, not the productive power. So the number of people decreases. And we also have a second category of jobs which increases, which are jobs subservient to industry. So here as well, something that is very important to keep in mind is that service jobs do not exist without physical flows. A service job as a teacher, for example, if you do not have the physical flows to make a building for teaching, if you do not have a physical flows to bring students and teachers on site, so means of transport, if you don't have a physical flows to do teaching materials, books in the ancient times, computers today, you do not have an education system. Take a doctor. A doctor, if you don't have the means to fabricate drugs, medical equipment, at the hospital, imaging equipment, the hospital itself, and the means of transportation to make it all work, you don't have doctors. If you don't have a manufactured car, you don't have the banker to give out the car loans, you don't have an insurer to insure cars, you don't have a driving school instructor to learn to drive, and you don't have the police officer to check that the people are driving correctly. All of these jobs become useless, although they are service jobs, in a world where you don't have the underlying physical flow, which is to manufacture cars. So a thing that you have to get out of your head, besides I'll show you the correlations in not too long, which show you that you really need to get it out of your head, which is that the idea that a world rich in service jobs is a dematerialized world. It is the exact opposite. A world rich in service jobs is a world in which there's lots of flows to manage, and that's why you need lots of people to take care of it. So service jobs increase as the industrial production increases, because we must continue, we must manage, we must sell, we must insure, we must teach, etc. And you see here that there's a period where the service jobs continue to increase because the industrial production continues to increase, even as the industrial jobs begin to decline. On the other hand, starting 2007, when the industrial production stopped increasing in Europe, we also start to have the same subject regarding service jobs. And you also see a new category which did not exist before. At the time of the oil shocks, they are the unemployed. But it's to say that since the energy supply per person is no longer increasing, basically, so the labor productivity increases very little, since increasing the productivity of labor means adding machines. Labor productivity increases little, and the existing jobs are too productive so that in an economy that has stopped growing rapidly, you can give everyone a job. In other words, starting the oil shocks, we enter in a time where the only way to give everyone a job is to decrease the productivity of people at work. And therefore, the equation is diverse depending on the country. Some do not accept and create the unemployed, France. Others accept and start creating jobs that are badly paid, poorly qualified, small jobs, part-time, etc. These are the more liberal systems, the English, German, Americans, etc. But it's one of the two branches that has to take place. So this is the dynamic evolution in France. I will now show you some more static and dynamic evolutions which corroborate what I just said. Here you have a graph in which, with the data of the World Bank, each dot represents a country. On the x-axis, the quantity of energy used per person, that is the fleet of machines per person on average in the country. And on the y-axis, you have the fraction of the working population that works in agriculture. You see, it's very simple. It's tell me how much energy you have per person in the country, and I'll tell you what the fraction of the working population is in the agriculture. See? Very simple. And here you have another graph which will tell you the same thing. It's the evolution from 1991 to 2014 of two data in the world. So here's the world average, the CO2 emissions per person, which you have here, and the fraction of working people in agriculture. Well, you see that the more the CO2 emissions increase, which is the case when you follow chronological order, the more the fossil fuel there is per person and the fewer farmers you have in the active population. So it's true for the world as a whole, but it's also true, for example, for India alone, or for example, for China or Brazil. I mean, I have 250 countries in the database. I'm not going to throw them all at you, but it's something that you see pretty much everywhere. So you put energy into a country, which means that you put machines in the country, and the peasants, you take them out of the agriculture. It's like that. And therefore, you create a rural exodus. That's right. Everywhere the same. In addition, the increase of agricultural productivity has enabled us to increase the number of animals that we eat, since we need more surface or more productive surfaces to eat animals that will themselves need to eat what grows. 80% of what grows in France is used to feed animals. It's true for the prairies, it's true for all the corn, except for the few grains of brands that I will not name. And this is true for half the wheat. This is true for almost all the soybean grown in the world, which is one of the 4 big grains that we cultivate, etc. Roughly 80% in Western countries of cultivated areas are used to feed animals, which you are going to eat after. And what you see here, so here I didn't give you the energy, but the greenhouse gases, whatever. What you see is that in the greenhouse gas emissions linked to food. Where there's meat or fish, the part related to fossil fuels is bigger. And what you see is that the sense of history, because of the increasing energy supply, is to go from left to right. Historically, we have eaten cereals and onions. That's why the peasants stank badly. So, cereals and onions. Then we started to eat small animals, eggs, well, first product of small animals, eggs, and then the small animals itself. Remember Henry IV, people must be able to eat small animals, the chicken pot. But it was already a waste, the hen, because she had laid her whole life, and you have an end-of-life waste, the hen, which we ate. Then we started to eat broiler chicken, then we started to eat pigs, then we started to eat cows. And being able to raise cows just to eat them is something that is the landmark of a country undergoing energy infusion. It doesn't work, and the archetype is the United States. It doesn't work in a country with a low energy supply. And because of the productivity brought by the machines, this more and more meat-based diet costs us less and less. Here you have the share of food in the household budget in the United States. So it's a long series, and I took the United States because it's easy to find long series on the American websites. Despite the genius of the French engineers, finding long series of this nature in 3 mouse clicks on the French sites is very difficult, and I'm not sure why. So anyways, it works very well in the United States. So in the US, you see that a small century ago, the food budget of households is a quarter of what they earn. And at the time, it was essentially home catering. So Mrs. Michu, and sorry for the sexist comment, but it was the reality, buys raw products to the local peasant, or instead of a local market, and makes the fresh tea for Mr. Michu and herself from leeks, from potatoes, from eggs and chicken. Today, when you go buy food, in fact, the majority of what you buy, 80% of food purchases of the French, goes through the supermarkets, and the bulk of what you buy is not food. The receipt when leaving the supermarket, it is the salaries of cashiers, or the salaries of engineers from the company that made the automatic payment terminals, it doesn't matter. It's a rental space, it's a storekeeper salary, it's the transporter's salary, it's Volvo trucks revenue, it's police's turnover, etc. It's anything but food. When you look at the raw products in what you buy, in the good cases it's 1/3 of the money, in the bad ones it's 3%. Take the example of a box of eggs. How much does a box of eggs cost in the supermarkets? The bad nasty ones, not the organic ones. No, that's the organic ones which cost 3 euros. Yeah, exactly, 1.50, 1.5 euros. Roughly. So €1.50 for 6 eggs. And since you're stronger than me in mental arithmetic, that puts the egg at... Ooh, it's hard, right? Oh, 15 divided by 6. How much is that? That puts the egg at 15 cents. 25 cents. We agree on that. So do you know how much the same egg is bought from the farm? Not bad at all. It's not far from 5. It's 6 to 7 cents. So you see that just on a box of eggs, with zero processing, like no processing at all, you have a factor of 4 between what exits the farm and what you pay at checkout. So I insist, the receipt today is anything but food, which means that when you do a long series, you actually have a massive inhomogeneity between what you observe at the start of a series and what you observe at the end of a series. Because at the start of a series, it's really the egg as it leaves the farm, bought at the market by Mrs. Michu, right? Today it's not that at all. And actually, if you look, actually outside the home, it's even worse. The omelette at the local cafe, you won't pay €1.50, you pay like 5 or 6 euros for free eggs. So that's at least 75 cents per egg. So you can add a factor of 10. So in fact, the true price of food today has roughly been divided by a factor of 20 on this time scale. So the rest is service. And we fall once more, again, on this dividing factor of a few tens. It varies depending on the product, thanks to energy abundance. This energy abundance has also brought us the means of transportation. Keep in mind, without going into the details, that the more a means of transport is modern, the more its consumption per kilometer is high. So we had bikes, so we had walking, we had cycling, we had the bus, we had the train, etc. And today we have the plane, which is the most energy intensive mode of transport per person of all those you can imagine. Once we had these extremely efficient means of transport, we also took the opportunity to do something else. So just a small note, in the Inhomogeneities in Long series, you have another thing to see, which is that over time, certain objects may no longer be assigned to solely their original function. Because a car today is not just a means of transport, it's also a living room on wheels. It is your own space that you transport to the office door. And that is also something that has value, and it's also a social status object. So I am making a small parenthesis here on the inhomogeneity of series. A car, when you compare it to something else, sometimes it's hard to know to what. Here is the last avatar of the car. This is the autonomous car by IKEA. Is it a car? Is it a living room on wheels? Is it a computer on wheels that incidentally transports you? Like, what is that thing? The connected autonomous car? So, yeah. So from time to time, you also have inhomogeneities to which, with which you must be careful. Getting back to the first object, which is to move. No, the means, the more modern they are, the more they consume per kilometer. No. What I'm saying is that the car consumes more than the plane, which is a more modern means. And the car consumes less than the plane, and the plane is more modern, and the car consumes more than the train, which is more ancient, and so on. And more than the bus, and the bus itself consumes more than the bike, which is older, etc. Basically, the more modern a means is, the more its consumption per kilometer is high. And in fact, that's what I'm representing here. What you have here is a graph which gives you the amount of energy used in gramic oil equivalent. And so, by the way, for bus, car, and plane, it really is oil. And so, per passenger kilometer, this is what you have here. And so you see that over time, it goes up. That is to say that it is lower for the train than for the bus, lower for the bus than for the car, and lower for the car than for the plane. And so on the x-axis, you have a number of passenger kilometers traveled in the year. So the area gives you the amount of energy allocated to each mode of transport. And so you understand that the road dominates today the transports we perform. And so I repeat, the sense of history is to go from the economical means to the less economical means, because there was more and more energy available per person. Who in this room has never taken the plane? 2. Did I count that correctly? Right. I would have asked the same question in 1950, I would have had to put it the other way around. That is to say, who in this room has already taken the plane? And I will probably seen 2 hands go up. The plane today in your social professional category and in your country is something we use as we breathe. It is extremely recent, and by the way, when you're my age, it's not completely sure that it will still be the case. It is extremely recent because it is something that requires very, very large amounts of energy. Remember that a Paris-New York round trip is a very, very big bathtub of oil. That's 400 to 500 liters of oil per person for one trip. That is to say roughly the same as the annual consumption of someone who uses their car for one trip. It's quite a lot, isn't it? So, the opening of École des Mines to abroad, Mines ParisTech, I must live with my time. In 2060, it is not completely ruled out that it looks more like night trains to Sweden than a plane to go to Kuala Lumpur or China. Or maybe you'll come back on boat, half wind power to go to China. It'll take you a month, but it'll leave you with many great memories. Here you see how people move over 1 century and a half, over 2 centuries. You have on a logarithmic scale here the number of kilometers traveled per person and per day, depending on the different means of transport. So you see that the horse was what gave the most person kilometers per day after walking, which is here in white, and 2 centuries ago. So 2 centuries ago, roughly, the daily journey of a human being was 3 kilometers on foot, which wears out the shoes. Because 2 centuries ago, as you saw earlier, the ordinary human being was a peasant who therefore went back and forth between the farm and the various places where he needed to go to do his jobs, so his fields, his orchards, his meadows, etc. This is what he was doing all day, 3 kilometers. And apart from that, he lived his whole life without going a few hundred kilometers from there. That's right. Then you see the horse, then here the rise of the train, and especially the rise of the car here, which has become the dominant mode of transport today. But the year when the car supplanted walking as the dominant mode of transport in terms of passenger kilometers per day, it was the 1950s. So I was not born, but barely, and my parents were born and well born. So my parents, who were already born at that time, were born in a world in which the dominant mode of transport for the population as a whole was walking. I don't know if you realize as well what it means in relation to the world you live in. We have decreased the number of peasants, and as I said earlier, we put these peasants somewhere. So where do you conveniently do industry and then tertiary jobs? In the cities. Historically, what is a city? It is a place of exchange. When you look at the cities that were built a long time ago, they were all organized around the places of exchanges, which are the marketplace, where I exchange goods, the place of worship, where I exchange beliefs and moral rules, and so the church, to speak of France, is always at the center, the town hall, or equivalent, which is to say where I exchange rules for living together, and school, where I exchange knowledge. So the places of exchange are at the center, and geometrically, the most efficient thing is a disk with everyone around. That's what the most compact shape is. The disk is the most compact shape. Around the places of exchange, which are all placed at the center. Once you develop abundant means to produce and transport, then two phenomena will occur. One, you will empty the rural areas. Two, you're going to put people where it's the most efficient to firstly produce and secondly to exchange production. And where is it the most efficient to produce and exchange production? In the cities. It's in the cities that it's the most efficient to do that. So you're going to put the people in the cities. And by increasing the energy, that's where I'm coming from, you increase the share of the population that lives in the cities. So this is how it happens for the world as a whole. In 1960, you had 30 or a little over 30% of the population living in cities with 3 tons of CO2 per person, which represents the fossil fuel that we use, that is to say, all energy that we use in first approximation. And you see that today we're at 5 tons, so we have increased the energy, and it has allowed us to put 2/3 of the populations in the cities. So this evolution can be seen at an accelerated rate in the countries which had an accelerated access to energy. Yes, question? Yes, there is a causal relationship because you're distorting the structure of the jobs. And because a system in which you have left all the craftsmen each in their corner with intermediate transport, that's much less efficient than a system in which you put 100 craftsmen together, which are then called factory workers, and in one place which you're going to specialize for producing that, and it will become much more efficient. I'll tell you in another way. To make cars, if you have the 12 bolt, which is made in Brive, and the setting in the door, which is made in Aurillac, and the end of a door, which is made in Bordeaux, you just can't deal with all that. So it's much easier to put everything together in one place and have operations that are assembled in the same place. After, when transports become more and more accessible, you can even go further and hyper-specialize certain operations on certain sites, since transporting costs you nothing, and then take them to other places where largely you hyper-specialize in something else. And that's why, for example, a manufacturer assembles truck cabins somewhere other than where he paints them. And between the two, you carry unpainted truck cabins. So you have exactly the same evolution to be observed for China, the same for Brazil, the same for Thailand, the same for Indonesia, etc. So more energy, I repeat, it distorts the structure of employment in the way that I mentioned to you earlier, and the jobs that appear are most efficient when you increase the size of the cities. So you can increase the size of cities while spanning them. And that's also exactly what happens when you have access to abundant energy.
because at this moment moving in mechanized modes becomes easy, and therefore you try to do the best of both worlds, that is to say a little space around everyone while having extremely important trade flows, and for that you can only succeed if you have plenty of energy. So in the low energy city, the most compact thing that there is the typical Parisian Haussmannian buildings. Paris is one of the densest cities in the world despite having an absence of very tall towers, because when you have very tall towers, you start to have to leave a little space around each tower. It's complicated to tighten the very tall towers as you tighten the Haussmannian buildings, which are all glued together. I mean, there's no space between the buildings. They all give on the street, but they're all glued together. With 10 or 30-story buildings, it's much more difficult to do that. And moreover, it's the most efficient way, when you don't have abundant energy, to move around. Because you can do everything on foot or, if necessary, on horse cart. And when you just give everyone a car, you just do Los Angeles, where you keep the urban exchange functions, while being able to put the city in 100 or 150 kilometers in diameter, where each person has a car, and you keep the same distances covered in an hour in a considerably more extensive town planning. This is the reason why when you look at, for example, the Parisian region, this is what the distance between home and work, which is representative of the which is representative of the daily exchanges in 1975. So where it's white, this is where we don't travel much. So in 1975, here is a dense city. People walk to work, and here, 80 kilometers away, you are still in the countryside, and people walk to their fields. All right, and this is how it evolves over time. And this is where we are in the early 2000s. All of these people have become urbans, peri-urbans, whose profession has become an urban-type profession. So they are no longer farmers, they are industry workers, service workers, and so they have entered in the system of movement, which is necessary for industry and services, and they use their car because here there is no public transport and there never will be. And so you start having extremely long distances between home and work. And by the way, this is where we're planning to put the Grand Paris Metro within a radius of 20 kilometers. It will absolutely not solve the problems for those who live farther away. This abundant energy has also made it possible to increase the number of housings, and it has allowed it to grow faster than the population. In 1978, or let's say at the time during the oil shocks, the average accommodation in France was 77 meters square, and you had a little less than 3 people inside it. Today, you have a little more than 2 people inside it, and the accommodation itself has grown bigger. So, obviously, it's the energy that made it possible to do this. So the energy has notably made divorce possible. Because to get a divorce, you need to have 2 houses where you only had 1 before. Otherwise, it's not called a divorce, it's called a household quarrel or whatever you wish, but it's not called a divorce. A divorce is a physical separation. You need to have a means to house people. And by the way, today one of the factors of upward pressure on the housing needs in France are divorces, is probably the first factor in upwards pressure. You find what I just told you here in this little graph, which gives you, this time for a given year, the CO2 emissions per person according to the share of employment in services. And you see that this graph says everything except the fact that when you increase jobs in services, proportionally, emissions decrease. It tells you everything but that. This is the only thing that you cannot see in this graph. So here is another way of seeing this time dynamically for the world as a whole. Again, you have the share of jobs in services in 1991 and in 2014 with the CO2 emissions per person. You see that they both march together, and that they also march together when you watch countries taken one by one. It works very well. Another development that the abundant energy has allowed is the increase of flows of goods, since it has also applied to trucks. Here, there's also something that you have to get out of your brains, which is that you could dematerialize transport by replacing it with information flows. Apparently, this is not true. When you look at the simultaneous evolution of information and transport flows, whether they are goods or people, by the way, you have exactly the same result. The two evolve together. So today, on a macroscopic scale, to say that to circulate more information will allow us to circulate fewer people or fewer goods is wrong. This is just not how it works. After we can ask ourselves the question, why does it not work like that? But the gross result is that it is not enough to increase the quantity of information circulating to say, bam, the result is that fewer people are moving or less goods are moving. Energy has therefore restructured the country what I am presenting to you for France has been applied in all countries who had access to energy, all of them. You had populated countryside and cities not too big. You moved to much bigger cities and empty countryside, and cities sprawled out. All countries who have followed the same trend. The only countries that didn't follow it are those who had geographical obstacles which opposed this evolution. I'll give you an example. Switzerland. Switzerland has in fact increased its cities, but they did not sprawl out too much. Why? Because when you have a city at the bottom of a valley, spreading the city means climbing on the flanks, and it's complicated. They did it a bit by putting chalets a bit everywhere, but they haven't done it in a massive way. In particular, they didn't put supermarkets in the outskirts of town because putting the supermarkets in terrace on the top of a city, it's more complicated than putting it on the outskirts. Once again, the countries which have not followed this evolution, it is because they had a physical barrier that prevented them from doing it. This abundant energy has also applied to leisure. First of all, leisure have increased because machines produce for us and it frees us up time. It frees us time for studies. In the days where there was no machine, there was no long studies. It frees up time for retirement. Back in the days where there were no abundant energy, there was no retirement. It frees up the time for holidays. It frees us time to do nothing on the weekends, and it frees us time to work only 35 hours per week. All this free time that we have gained, we owe it to the abundant energy. Here to remember something that will apply not only to you, but to the people you will be working and living with for the rest of your life. In a world with constrained energy, it is not the increase of free time, well managed, let's say, that will apply. What you see here is one of the occupations of free time called tourism. So I did a little bit of math a few years ago. I did not redo the computation, but the order of magnitude is still the same. And it gives you the emissions of greenhouse gases, therefore again the fossil energy consumption, related to how we spend our vacations. Here I counted the initial trip, the fact of going to your vacation spot by train, car, or plane. I counted the possible manufacture of the object in which you live during the vacation, the tent, the caravan, the secondary residence. I considered that if it was built, I counted it, and if it was from the old mother-in-law, which we have to endure, we counted nothing because she had her house already built a long time ago. And I have also taken into account local trips, if there are any, etc. If it is the ski holidays, I took into account the heating of the apartment, since in general skiing is complicated when it's a bit hot, it's rather a bit cold. And therefore the apartments are heated, preferably with fuel oil, and so on. So I've taken into account all that stuff. And what you see is that the most modern form of tourism, this one, I'm going on a 3-day trip to a hotel by taking the plane, is also the one that assumes the greatest amount of energy consumed to afford a week's vacation. Conversely, this and that, which are the forms of leisure that have appeared with paid leave, that is to say that people took their bikes to go to camping or took the train to go camping, that's what they did at the beginning of paid leaves. And these are the most fossil energy efficient forms, and therefore energy efficient forms, to exert. You see again that energy abundance has distorted our lifestyles, and we owe the fact of being able to benefit from this leisure offer to the fact that we are under energy perfusion, all of us, as much as we are. This is why it's currently developing in Sweden, for example, since a few years, and we've been talking about it in the media for a few weeks, but actually when you look at the stats, it starts a few years ago, a beginning of a decrease in the number of planes taken by the Swedes, which is now described by the media as shame to fly, because Scandinavians have a rather more developed environmental sensitivity than the rest of Europeans, which can be explained for historical and geographical reasons. We will find this economically with what it costs, expressed in hours of working time, to take the plane. I'll tell you again, the real price of things is the hours of working time. And what you see is that the price expressed in hours of working time to take the plane was divided by an extremely large factor within a few decades. This is another way of saying that energy has become more abundant, that is to say, it is easier to buy a lot with an hour of work. It's the same thing. Energy also powers industrial machines, and industrial machines will be used to make all of the objects that surround you today. So the tables on which you are leaning for some, the chairs on which you are sitting for all, the clothes you wear, the glasses for some, shoes, etc. It was all made by industrial machines. So energy powers industrial machines. It is the exoskeleton that allows to do everything, including scissors, cosmetics, and Netflix movies, but it also serves as raw material. So you have in energy a component that is sometimes called non-energetic, and you might tell me the non-energetic in energy is a little complicated, but in fact, when you see non-energetic uses of energy, especially in oil and gas, it serves as raw materials for organic chemistry. All of organic chemistry is based on derivatives of gas and oil. Here, Americans did a funny little test. They took out of a house all of the products that contain oil derivatives, and nothing remains. In fact, they should have also turned off the floors because there's polish on the floors. They should have turned off the curtains. They should have turned off the curtain rod. They should have removed the paint. I mean, basically, they should have removed everything. Oil today is not just something that drives a machine. It is also the basis of organic chemistry to manufacture the totality of products that surround us. Because you pretty much don't have a single product that surrounds you in which you do not have a derivative of petroleum. These objects that surround us, we will have to make them, and besides, some of them will also use energy. Here you have, for example, the evolution of the rates in household appliances. So I have not found a more recent series. I should the equipment rates have considerably increased everywhere, but today you don't have a single household in which you don't have a fridge, a washing machine, etc., and a whole bunch of stuff that use energy. So the industry makes objects which requires energy. And then these objects, some of them, we're going to use them, even the lawnmower, etc. And it's all going to use energy. And then we see that the equipment rates are basically increasing ever and all the time. I already told you, but I'll say it again. Divorce is energy intensive. Because when you divorce, you have to double the accommodations. And so you have to double the energy consumption of houses. If they, more exactly, you increase it in proportion to the new area occupied. You need to make more housing, which uses energy, and you need to buy furniture for twice as many homes. So there are some things which you don't really double, but there are things which you do double. For example, you have twice as many beds. Everyone sleeps in a bed. And you have twice as many sinks, twice as many hot plates, twice as many, etc. And all this must be manufactured. And when there are children, which is not always the case, but when there are kids, they must then be brought from one house to the other. This requires additional trips, sometimes quite long. As I told you earlier, a number of things which are considered today normal, so I repeat, retirement, studies, etc., is energy. When President Mitterrand in 1981 said everyone must go to university, the implicit promise behind that was everyone will have an office job, and that was a way of saying, I promise you infinite abundant energy society. Since I showed you earlier that a world with everyone in an office is an extremely energy-intensive society, at the time when Mitterrand said everyone has to go to university, in reality, he made the implicit promise that we would be able to live in a world of machines for eternity. This is the implicit promise he made. You see that energy is not at all detachable from a whole bunch of things, even including the way in which we consider access to competences. So, the hospital is also very energy intensive. In France, the hospital is nearly 5% of the country's carbon footprint. So as a famous comedian put it, if it is the elderly who use the most the health services, it is only needed to save the last year of life. In the meantime, it would still pose the question of how long in a world of constrained energy we can continue to arbitrate in favor of people who ask for a very heavy machinery when they are already very old, to the disadvantage of all the others, including the young people. So, there you have it. Energy is everywhere. And once I've told you this, we're going to do a little bit of economics. Here is planet Earth. So planet Earth, as comedian Coluche would say, is square with eyes in the corners. Just kidding. Planet Earth is made up of resources in an anthropocentric view, so I will place myself from the point of view of man, and from the point of view of man, planet Earth is a bunch of resources, okay? This is our home, this is where we live, these are resources to which we have access. These resources, I will classify them in two categories. On the one hand, the resources that can renew themselves on short timescales, I will call them renewable, and on the other hand, resources that cannot renew themselves on short timescales, which I will call non-renewable. So copper ore is definitely non-renewable. There's no large-scale transmutation on Earth which replenishes the ore stockpile of copper. Fossil fuels are renewable if you wait a few tens of millions of years. It's not really a short timescale, so I put them in non-renewable. On the other hand, the grass or the solar radiation is reasonably renewable on short timescales. These resources are all free, and they are all the results of what has happened since the Big Bang, the whole being free. Since the Big Bang, proton soup and everything else, a whole bunch of processes took place, and today we have a free Mendeleev table and all the combinations it offers us on the surface of a planet. And all of this was done for free. Thereupon we arrive and decide to have a productive activity. What is productive activity for men? It is to take stuff from this great choice of resources and transform resources into something else which is more interesting to us than the original resource. For example, I have rough flints. It is more interesting to have cut flints and run behind my prey. For example, I have deer. It's more interesting to have deer antlers trimmed to make a number of things, etc. So the productive activity of men is just, I use existing resources, I transform them, so transformation energy, got it? And so I use energy, at the time obviously just that of my arms, legs, and the fire, and I make something else of it. And over time we will increase the energy we will seek to have at our disposal, so I repeat, 500,000 years of energy transition, which will allow us to increase the productive capacity of each of us. So we extract resources more quickly, and they are transformed more quickly. As soon as non-renewable resources are extracted from the environment to turn them into something else, the stock of non-renewable resources goes down. So at first, it does not jump quickly, although it would seem, for example, on flint that there may have been local shortages during the Paleolithic. So we were able to have, from time to time, local shortages on resources, and don't laugh, because at that time, they would die of it. And over time, we also understood that there was a part of what we transform that could be kept to accelerate future transformation. It is called capital. So capital is the part of the production which isn't consumed right away and which is reusable to increase future production. So this is great and all, but we grow, we multiply, we produce more and more, and we empty faster and faster the non-renewable stocks. And at one point, we become so productive and so numerous that we also start to empty renewable stocks. So today we have started to empty the stocks of species, for example, that are renewable. We started to empty forest stocks, which were renewable. We started to empty fish stocks, which were renewable, and so on. We have even started to empty soil stocks, which are slowly being renewed. So yeah, we have started to empty a certain number of stocks that are renewable. And so I said transformation, so I said energy. But I said transformation, so I also said unwanted products of transformation. Because when you transform, there's always a point where you have unwanted byproducts of the transformation. These undesirable byproducts of transformation have been given a name in our language. It's called pollution. So pollution is all the unwanted byproducts of transformation, that is, those that will have an effect that we are not looking for, and not only that we don't look for, but rather that annoys us. Basically, pollution is all that annoys the shit out of us. So, said in more orthodox terms, these are all the products that we will introduce to the environment and which will have an effect of degrading the quality of the remaining assets.
This is pollution. Inside that, you can fit into this definition climate change, erosion of biodiversity, overfishing, and so on. So in this matter, the economics that we have built, and that I will detail in a short time, consist of counting the annual flow and considering that it's all that matters. And I'll explain why. Basically, we count the moment when we transform because transformation is the action of man and money only pays men. So in this matter, we have decided that the only marker of this physical flow of a system that I present to you here is the monetary counterpart of the annual transformation flow. And this annual transformation flow in economist jargon is called GDP. It's the monetary counterpart. So we could have just as well had an accountability that would say I count positive what I do, negative what I destroy, and the day the marginal value of the last car I built is inferior to the marginal value of the last bits of iron ore, copper ore, lithium ore, vanadium, chromium, and fossil fuels that I used to make this car, I stop making cars and live happily ever after with the existing cars. You clearly see that this is not what we do. In fact, the economic system is an absolutely limitless system. Nothing in the economic system says when the GDP reaches $8 trillion on Earth, it stops. We have made a potentially infinite system, and that's why it's so attractive. So why did we do this? Because 2 centuries ago, when we started to theorize economics, you had a certain number of people who made the following observation. They say the economics is the management of what is rare. And what is rare 2 centuries ago is the human factor. We had lots of species, lots of space, lots of worlds. The United States were barely at the beginning of their colonization. Russia is immense, and so on. We don't even know how far the oceans go, so no problem on resources. What is rare 2 centuries ago is the human factor. So economists 2 centuries ago, like Mr. Say, who wrote very exactly what is written here, well, they say to themselves, in first order approximation, I will only look at the limitation coming from men. The rest, I don't give a damn. I don't count it. And if I consider that resources are infinite, you agree with me, any variation of the stock is 0. Delta S over infinity always makes 0. So I will count as 0 the factors which do not come from men, approximation of the first order, which is still that of economics today. So I'm going to say something that will make very sad your director of studies who has just entered the room. All economics that you're taught in school is wrong when it comes to approaching the human system as a whole. When it comes to approaching trade-offs within the human system, it works. When it comes to approaching the totality of men in their environment, it only says nonsense. It is just not made for that. So in other words, the economics that I learned at school and that you still learn today is that the productive system is fueled by 2 factors of production, which are human capital and human labor, and this is enough to fill the supermarket. It doesn't take into account machines, it doesn't take into account resources. So it turns out that at the time we could have won the battle in another way. It turns out that 2 centuries ago, Mr. Charles Dupin, student from Polytechnic University, therefore a very good person, baron of his profession, he made a first calculation of conversion into slave equivalents. So at the time he didn't call them slave equivalents, but rather worker equivalents. And so Monsieur Dupin says, I'm going to look in France and Great Britain the productive means available to us in addition to men. So he understood everything about physics. And I am going to convert them into human worker equivalents. So I take the population, I make them human workers, and by the way, he counted children for a quarter and women for a half, and we ask ourselves whether that's where the expression my other half comes from when we speak of our significant other. No, really, I mean, where else could it come from otherwise my other half? Okay, maybe like the other half a couple, I guess that could be an explanation. Anyway, some ask whether this is where it comes from. Still, he takes the population and he also takes the auxiliaries that were at the time boats, mills, etc. Afterwards, Monsieur Dupin says, if I take the population and the auxiliaries, then it becomes normal that Great Britain, which has a population of roughly the same size as that of France, has already an industrial production 3 times higher. It is normal because it is not only men who work. There are also mills, draft animals, and boats. If at the time we had listened to Monsieur Dupin and not Monsieur Say, it is not completely sure that we would have built economics the same way. It's not completely sure. And what the physicist says is that what I have on the right are my 92 elements from the Mendeleev table arranged in another way than what I had in the initial resources. It's just that. Do you agree with me? There is nothing other than the 92 elements of the Mendeleev table in all objects of everyday life. Nothing. Do you agree? Except that we didn't find them in this form in the environment. So I found them in a form and I transformed them. So for that, I need to find my 92 elements of a Mendeleev table, it's called resources, and to transform them. My transformative capacity, these are the order of magnitude calculations that I showed you earlier, it comes for 1 from the muscles of man and for 200 from Iron Man. That is to say, the fleet of machines that we have built. This is the ratio of 1 to 200 that I have developed upon for you earlier. The capital in this story is done like the rest. That is, this building, which is an element of capital, was made like the rest by transforming natural resources. This building, like the rest, is made by transforming iron ore, that is to say, iron and oxygen arranged in a certain way, that is to say, stones, which are natural resources, that is to say, paint, transform natural resources, etc. So it's made exactly the same way, it's just that it doesn't get destroyed when you use it, which means that while we're in this room, to your greatest pleasure as well as mine, it doesn't collapse. Here you understand that there's not only men who are limiting factors of the system. In the modern world, energy is a limiting factor of the system. In other words, if I deprive my fleet of machines of energy, I would deprive my productive system of its productive capacity, even if the bankers are very nice and even if the unemployed are ready to go work. This is just not enough in the world in which we live. If I deprive the system of resources, for example, I have no fish to catch, the GDP of fishing is zero. The GDP of Léon de Bruxelles is zero. I mean, he has to change from mussels and chips to steak and chips, but otherwise it's zero, etc. And so if you don't have the resources and the energy, you won't have a production, even if you have highly motivated workers and even if you have very friendly bankers. So historically, until now, all of this has not been a limiting factor. The limiting factor has indeed been men. You have here a reconstruction of a GDP since year zero, that is to say, since the birth of Mr. Jesus Christ. And while we didn't have any mechanical auxiliaries in significant numbers, there is no growth. The population is reasonably stable at this time as well. At this time, since man is productive like its muscular system and no more, the most populous country of the world has the largest GDP of the planet, and that is China. Absolutely. So China today says one thing in the concert of nations. Says, listen, don't make us laugh. For 2 millennia, we have been the dominant economic power of the planet. It's not because a century of oil put the United States in our place, but it's going to change our view of the world. Therefore, first, we're going to take back our place, and then we'll talk. It's roughly this way that things are. Very few mechanical aids, very little growth, massive arrival of mechanical aids and fossil fuels, and bang! The economic model says we're going to have 3% growth for eternity. So don't laugh. I happen to be part of a body called the High Council for Climate. We were presented 3 weeks ago with the national low carbon strategy developed by some of your elders, to whom we have forced to say that to decrease sharply, to divide by 6 or 7 the quantity of fossil energy that we enter in France would increase the French GDP. It's in it, for real. Because the economic models tell you that. Because the economic models can tell you that we can increase the GDP by dividing the energy by 10. Since energy is not an input, there is no problem. No problem. In the meantime, this is not what is happening, so I present to you the best macroeconomic model in the world, called a straight line. You have here in the x-axis the amount of energy used by men, that is to say, and I repeat, the fleet of machines in service. And on the y-axis, the economic value of production, which follows in a nearly linear fashion. Very simple, really very simple. This is valid in absolute value, and it's also valid in variation. You have here in green the annual variation of the amount of energy used on Earth, that is to say, the annual variation of the number of machines in service, and in blue, the annual change in human economic production. You see that give me the one, I give you the other, and give me the other, I give you the one. All right? I'll tell you in another way. The euros only measure monetarily a flow that kilowatt hours measure physically. So these are two units of measure that look at the same thing, that is, a flow of transformation. I come back to my curve that I showed you earlier of the energy supply per person, and this time we'll make another comment. You see that over the period leading to the oil shock, the energy supply increases by 2.5% per year per person. It means that the fleet of machines per person increases by at least 2.5% per year. You have a little bit of energy efficiency that adds to it. This means that as long as you do not have any limiting factors on the resources to be transformed, physical production per person increases by at least 2.5% per year. Therefore, the monetary counterpart of its production increases by at least 2.5% per year. In fact, you'll see this a little bit more. After the oil shocks, you see that the pace is slowing down. In fact, it slows down completely for OECD countries, the so-called rich countries, Western countries, and the surplus that you have here is the rise of China and then later of other emerging countries. This translates to the boom of the amount of coal per person, which is a mean effect. In fact, in Western countries, the amount of coal used does not increase, even decreases a little. However, it is exploding in China, and today China uses half of the coal consumed in the world.
At this point, the system starts to slow down a little. That is to say that we continue to have an increase in physical production per person, a lot weaker and much weaker than the rate of redistribution to which we had gotten used to during that time. That is to say that we have organized in all Western states of the world a welfare state, more or less. So more or less, like less welfare in the United States and more welfare in the Scandinavian states, but in all the countries of the world we organized a welfare state which redistributes part of what is produced, and the rate of growth of its redistribution is tied to the rate of growth in production, that is to say a few percents per year, and we do not put in the system the ability to correct it quickly if growth runs out of steam. That is to say, we don't tell public servants, we warn you, if growth runs out of steam, wage increases for seniority, it stops. We don't tell the retirees, we warn you, if the pace of growth runs out of steam, automatically you'll start retirement later and get paid less, and so on and so forth. We don't say all those things. We say, no, if growth runs out of steam, we continue to pay you the same and increase you for seniority in the same way. At this point, we have to find the money somewhere and we get into debt. In all Western countries, public debt was non-existent before the oil shocks. It appears and grows, well, very small before the oil shocks. It appears and grows everywhere, so it's not only the French politicians who are incapable. It appears and grows everywhere in all Western countries after the oil shocks exactly for this reason, because the rate of increase in production per person becomes insufficient to ensure the rate of increase of redistribution per person. Starting 2005, and I'll tell you in the next course why, the energy supply per person starts to become roughly constant again in the world, and in fact it is declining in the OECD area, I'll show you right after. And from there the system completely falls apart, massive financial crisis of Lehman Brothers, which is a consequence of what I'm telling you, and I'll show you in not too long, but chronologically and not a cause. Debt starts to explode. We arrive in a thing that has been unknown for a very long time called negative interest rates, etc. And it's the system's response to the fact that we have built this something that depended on energy abundance, and that this energy abundance is starting slowly today, to unravel. By the time you're my age, we're going to pass in overdrive in this domain. And this is why your future will not be the tendential extension of the past. So a few graphs to finish. You have here the variation of GDP per person in the world, therefore of economic production per person in the world, since 1960. You have it here in annual variation, and I put in orange the averages over 3 periods, which are before the oil shock, between the oil shock of 79 and the oil shock of 2007-2008, and since the oil shock of 2007-2008. There is a small artifact which I will not talk about today because it's too long, but debt is something that makes it possible to generate GDP without production. I mean, it's a bit complicated, but you start to have a boundary effect. You see that at the time of 30 glorious years, the energy grows strongly per person, and the production per person grows even more strongly, since there is the energy efficiency gain between the two. Engineers know how to make more efficient cars that have the same quantity, that drives more with the same quantity of oil if it's the same car, or a larger, more expensive car which uses the same amount of oil. Afterwards, you see that the energy per person increases less quickly. It's actually 1% rather than 0.5. And you see that the GDP per capita starts to grow less quickly. And since the, it's very contrasted there. You see that there's a great episode of volatility. You see it goes down. In fact, there are 2 regions of the world which evolve in a very discriminated way from this moment, the OECD and the rest. So I'll show you where we live, that is the OECD. So OECD, here is how evolves a first part of OECD, that is to say the European Union, which is where we live. Until the oil shocks, the energy supply per person strongly increases. It increases very little between the oil shocks in 2006, and actually you see that the maximum is in 2006, 2 years before Lehman Brothers. It is not Lehman Brothers who caused the economic crisis which reduced the amount of energy used. It is the contraction of the available supply of energy that has slowed down the GDP, which made borrowers unable to repay the debt which they started to contract when the economy slowed down for the first time in 79. And it's arrival with 2 triggers.
In 79, we began to go into debt to compensate for the fact that the energy stopped increasing. And in 2006, when the energy starts to decrease, we no longer have a capacity to go further into debt at the right speed to repay the Ponzi scheme that we have started to create. And over the last years, you see an effect that I'm going to talk about next time, which is the new supply of the global energy markets from oil and gas from source rock in the United States. Well, mostly oil. And what you see in Europe, it's that the GDP per capita increases strongly during the 30 glorious years. Then the energy per person stops increasing, but GDP per capita continues to increase. And you see that since 2006, the increase has been almost zero. And by the way, the industrial production in Europe today is still lower than that of 2007. Ton kilometers by truck today in Europe are lower than that of 2007. The index of construction today in Europe is lower than that of 2007. So part of the increase in GDP that we had since 2007 is false GDP. It's an accounting artifact, which is basically a bad fix for inflation, if I can put it this way. And at this point, you ask the Great Britons, are you happy? And the Great Britons tell you no. I remind you that in a referendum, in general, you answer the one who asks the question, you do not answer the question. President de Gaulle learned it at his own cost. And in general, when you ask, oh, and by the way, the first referendum in France on the European Constitution, you remember the result. So we just ask the question again in another way. But so the referendum, historically, is a very good way to answer the questionnaire and not the question. So the English say to the person asking the question, we are not happy about the way things are going. By the way, starting the moment where the GDP per capita does not increase anymore, and you create a space of free movement in an area where you have a difference of 1 to 5 between what the people in the East earn and what the people in the West earn, what do you think happens? It balances out. So when you're in an expanding universe, it's okay because you can increase the people's income on one side while you continue to increase, or at least do not decrease, the people's income on the other side. So when Spain and Portugal enter the European Union at a period of strong growth, the purchasing power of the French can continue to increase at the same time as the purchasing power of the Spaniards increases strongly. But when you let enter in 2005, that is to say 2 years or 1 year before the European energy maximum, the countries of the East saying to them, come in our dance, your GDP will increase at the same time as ours will continue to increase. And then bam, the energy per person begins to decline. At this time, the area's GDP no longer increases, your communicating vessel effect applies, and whatever the Eastern countries take, the Western countries lose. It's mechanical. And so there are two ways to lose it. The Polish plumber comes to London, and he gives you this result. And the second way to lose it is Renault invests in Romania, and at this time the French workers start yelling. And these are the two ways that you have the rebalancing process that applies. And this is just the beginning. As long as we stay, and I'm not trying to do cheap politics here, but I'm just telling you that as long as we stay in a space where everyone moves and pays as he wants, while you have initial potential differences that you cannot homogenize from above, you will have rebalancings with loss for a certain number of people. So the temptation of Frexit, Italixit, Spainxit, or whatever Swedexit will increase, and all of these pressures will increase because of that. And at the source, you find energy. When you do a trend analysis, you see, by the way, that this variation of the energy supply per person is heir to the very strong trend, which I will come back in the next course, which has been expressed for decades. Here you have a curve which gives you the variation of the energy supply of the European Union. It's not the supply, it's the variation for the last 50 years. What you see is that the variation with large deviations follow a trend which is strong and then less strong and less strong and less strong and less strong until it reaches the point where it enters negative territory. And by the way, at that moment, we start to have something that is reasonably volatile. If we say to ourselves that this second derivative has good reasons to be representative of the internal dynamics of the process, at this point, you say to yourself that the rest of the story is that the energy supply is going to continue to decline, so that the GDP growth rate, which was weaker and weaker over the same period, will continue to decline and move into durably negative territory. So the life that awaits you and me for the next decades to come, if everything goes well, as well, has all the chances of looking nothing like what I've known since I was born. That is to say, it will not be a world of expansion, but it will be a world of contraction. So we're going to need your creative genius, because I assure you that managing a world in contraction is way more dreadful as an exercise of optimization under constraints than managing a world that is expanding. So we're really going to need you. We'll also need me, but we're really going to need you in the sense that we're really going to need the best elected brains in the country to tackle one of the hardest problems you're going to have to solve, which is to keep a system more or less stable in a context of contraction of available resources. I can assure you that what you saw in the writing and speaking parts of the entry exam, it's a little beer next to that. I take the OECD area as a whole, and I will end with this. Same motivations, same punishments. The supply per person increases until 79, passes through a maximum in 2006. This is also true in the United States. In the United States, the energy supply per person has gone through a maximum 2 years before Lehman Brothers, I insist. You also have this evolution, which in fact reflects an evolution in trend that has been taking place for a very long time. And very probably the same thing will happen in this area there and in the world as a whole. There, so what I told you during this first module is that the world in which we live was notably allowed, not only, but was notably allowed by the fact that we have found for free under our feet pockets of sun, as Yann Arthus Bertrand says very nicely, but it's to say fossil fuel free with a very high calorific value, therefore a very large exothermic capacity, which allowed us to transform at an accelerated speed all of the other equally free sources that we have found on Earth, which has allowed us to build the socio-economic system in which you grew up. That is to say, most people in the cities, most of the people in service activities, everyone eating steak at every meal, people with lots of free time, and the demands of the employers' union MEDEF and the workers' union CGT, which can both be granted without problem. This is the world in which you have grown up. And by the way, the main ParisTech international exchange program, since airplanes are needed for it. And the way I account for the transformation flow is a way that I built by construction without limits, since the only thing that I was really knowing in the matter, that is to say the fact that the Earth is 13,000 kilometers in diameter and not 14,000 nor 15,000, I have ignored it, I hid it under the rug. So based on this axiom, which is only a first order approximation, I have refined my visions for 2 centuries, but without questioning the fundamental axiom, which is that nature is free. So obviously I don't see this limit since it is not in the system. In the next class, we will not look at this, which is one of the first limiting factors of a system, which is to say pollution. We will concentrate on a very specific pollution called climate change. So climate change is just a downstream consequence of this transformation flow. In the next course, what we'll really look at is a bottleneck that will eventually apply upstream of the system, which is called the supply in fossil energy. We could also, of course, if we had the time, look at the supply in metals. It's another possible limiting factor of a system. The supply of species is another possible limiting factor of a system, and so on. But we are going to look, we're going to discuss upon the upstream supply in fossil fuel, that is to say in transformation capacity. So there you go. This is the table in which we will be for the next course, to which I invite you with pleasure. Good night.